Hello there, and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm glad you're here tonight. Find a comfortable place to settle in. Let the room become quiet, put down whatever the day has been asking you to carry, and allow yourself to spend a little time in a part of San Francisco that has been discussed, criticised, defended, studied, ignored, and misunderstood for more than a century. Tonight we're going to the Tenderloin. It sits in the centre of San Francisco, close to City Hall, Union Square, Market Street, expensive hotels, theatres, offices, and some of the most valuable real estate in the United States. You can walk from polished storefronts into the Tenderloin in a matter of minutes. There is no long road announcing the change. No wall separates one part of the city from the other. Sometimes all it takes is crossing a street. That closeness is important because the Tenderloin has never existed at the edge of San Francisco. It has always been near the centre of power. Mayors works nearby, judges passed through it, police officers patrolled it, business owners invested around it, reformers held meetings about it, developers made plans for it, newspapers described it as a problem waiting to be solved. Still, the neighbourhood remained. San Francisco changed around it again and again. Buildings rose, buildings fell, earthquakes rearranged entire blocks. Fires erased neighbourhoods, industries disappeared, fortunes arrived from gold, railroads, shipping, finance, tourism and technology. The city repeatedly introduced new plans, new rules, new police campaigns, new redevelopment programs, and new promises of improvement. The Tenderloin accepted some of those changes, resisted others, and survived all of them. That is what makes this neighbourhood such an unusual subject. Its history is not simply a record of crime, poverty, nightlife, or political failure. It is the history of what happens when a city tries to control a place without fully understanding why that place exists. What time is it where you are listening tonight? Maybe it is late, and the streets outside your home are already quiet. Maybe you're still awake after a long day. Perhaps you're listening from San Francisco itself, close enough to recognise the street names we will visit. You might be somewhere far away, in a place where the Tenderloin is known only through headlines, films, photographs, or stories told by someone who once lived there. Wherever you are, consider the neighbourhood around you for a moment. Think about the parts of your city that people describe carefully. Every city has them. The district people warn visitors about, the street that appears in political speeches, the blocks that officials promise to improve, the place blamed for problems that began somewhere else. Residents know that the public description is incomplete, but the description becomes powerful because it is repeated so often. The Tenderloin has lived beneath that kind of description for generations. Before we continue, if this kind of slow, historical storytelling helps you settle in, you can subscribe to the channel and give the video a like. There is no need to interrupt your evening to do it. Wait until you are comfortable. If something in this story changes the way you think about San Francisco, that would be a good time. You can also leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I enjoy seeing how far these stories travel, especially when the subject is a neighbourhood built by people who arrive from many different parts of the world. Now let us begin with a simple walk. Imagine that you're standing near Union Square in downtown San Francisco. The sidewalks are busy, hotel doors open and close. Shoppers carry bags past restaurants and department stores. Cable cars move along nearby streets. Visitors look at maps and decide whether they have enough time to see one more attraction before dinner. Walk west or southwest for several blocks. The change does not happen all at once. The stores become smaller. Residential hotels appear above the sidewalks. Fire escapes cover building fronts. Corner markets advertise goods in several languages. Churches, social service offices, bars, apartment entrances, inexpensive restaurants, theatres, laundromats, clinics, and community organisations share the same crowded streets. There are children going home from school, elderly residents carrying groceries, workers waiting for buses, people sitting outside single-room occupancy hotels, recent immigrants learning the routines of a new city, long-time tenants greeting neighbours they have known for years. Street vendors, outreach workers, tourists who have taken a wrong turn, police officers, musicians, landlords, cooks, nurses, pastors, and people with nowhere private to go. All of them occupy the same small area. Descriptions of the Tenderloin often begin with what is visibly wrong: open drug use, homelessness, violence, untreated illness, overcrowded housing and poverty are real parts of its history and its present. Pretending otherwise would not make the neighbourhood more respectable. It would only make the history less honest. But stopping there creates another kind of dishonesty. The Tenderloin has also been a place where people with little money could find a room near the centre of the city. It has sheltered immigrants arriving without established communities. It has offered space to workers who could not afford other neighbourhoods. It became a refuge for people pushed out of more respectable districts because of their race, occupation, sexuality, gender identity, income, disability, or reputation. City records have described it as a neighbourhood with dense populations of children, seniors, people with disabilities, communities of colour, immigrants, artists, and community organisations. It has also been recognised for a long history of activism and affordable housing protection. Those facts do not cancel one another. A neighbourhood can contain danger and care at the same time. It can be neglected by institutions while being fiercely protected by residents. It can be treated as disposable by the rest of the city, while serving as the only stable home thousands of people have known. That contradiction is not a side note in the Tenderloin's history. It is the main story. The area is relatively small. The boundaries have changed depending on who is drawing the map, but the historic district generally occupies several dozen blocks north of Market Street. The National Register listing for the Uptown Tenderloin Historic District includes all or part of 33 blocks, roughly bounded by Market, McAllister, Golden Gate, Larkin, Geary, Taylor, and Ellis Streets. 33 blocks do not sound large enough to hold so much history. Within that area, San Francisco placed many of the things it wanted nearby but did not want to examine closely. Cheap lodging, nightlife, gambling, sex work, bars that welcomed customers rejected elsewhere, residential hotels filled with workers, pensioners, performers, sailors, veterans, immigrants, and people living alone. The neighbourhood's location made it useful. It was close enough to downtown for workers and visitors to reach easily. It was close enough to government buildings for officials to monitor. It was close enough to wealthy districts for customers to arrive discreetly. Yet its reputation allowed respectable San Franciscans to pretend that the behaviour inside it belonged to a separate world. This arrangement required a particular kind of public imagination. A businessman could drink in the Tenderloin and condemn it the next morning. A politician could receive support from interests connected to nightlife and later call for moral reform. A police officer could collect payments from illegal businesses while publicly participating in a campaign against vice. Newspapers could profit from dramatic stories about the district while advertising the theatres, restaurants, and entertainment that drew people there. The neighbourhood was treated as both temptation and excuse. That helps explain the title of our story. The Tenderloin was not uncontrollable because no one tried to control it. San Francisco tried constantly. The city controlled it through policing, licensing, zoning, raids, building codes, redevelopment schemes, street closures, moral campaigns, public health rules, and political pressure. What the city could not control was the set of conditions that kept recreating the neighbourhood. People needed inexpensive rooms, workers needed places near downtown, new arrivals needed communities, restaurants and theatres needed employees. Customers wanted entertainment that respectable districts would not openly provide. Politicians wanted donations and votes. Property owners wanted income from buildings that were too old or too small for wealthier tenants. As long as those needs remained, the Tenderloin remained useful. This is where the phrase, clean up the neighbourhood, becomes more complicated than it first appears. Clean up what? Crime, unsafe buildings, corrupt policing, exploitative landlords, public intoxication, poverty, nightlife, immigrants, single adults, people with disabilities, queer communities, sex workers, cheap restaurants, residential hotels, protesters, families living in small rooms because they could afford nowhere else. Different reformers gave different answers, and those answers revealed what they believed a city was supposed to look like. Some wanted safer streets for residents, others wanted the residents removed. Some fought dangerous housing conditions, others wanted the housing demolished. Some opposed organised crime and police corruption. Others used the language of public safety to close businesses that served communities they disliked. The distinction matters because people who claim to be saving a neighbourhood are not always trying to save the people who already live there. San Francisco has repeatedly approached the Tenderloin as though it were an unfortunate stain beside more successful districts. Yet the neighbourhood was produced by San Francisco itself. Its crowded hotels, underground economies, nightlife, poverty, and constant movement did not appear from nowhere. They were connected to decisions made throughout the city. When wealthy neighbourhoods restricted certain kinds of housing, low-income residents concentrated elsewhere. When officials tolerated illegal businesses in selected areas, vice became geographically organised. When industries hired temporary or unmarried workers, residential hotels became necessary. When social institutions released vulnerable people without sufficient support, the streets absorbed the consequences. The city often pushed difficult realities into the Tenderloin and then criticised the neighbourhood for displaying them. To understand that pattern, we have to resist the temptation to begin with the worst photograph we can find. Instead, picture an ordinary window several floors above the street. Behind it is a room. Perhaps it is small enough that a bed, chair, sink and dresser nearly fill the entire space. A person has lived there for 20 years. The hallway bathroom is shared. The elevator does not always work. Rent is lower than almost anywhere else within walking distance of downtown. From that room, the resident can reach a clinic, a grocery store, a church, a park, a community centre, and several bus lines without owning a car. Neighbours notice when the resident has not been seen. Someone downstairs accepts packages. A restaurant worker knows the usual order. A non-profit employee helps with a housing form. A pharmacist remembers which prescription is due. From outside, the building may look like evidence of urban failure. From inside, it may be the structure holding a person's life together. This is one reason redevelopment has always been dangerous in the Tenderloin. Improving a building can make it safer, but it can also make it more expensive. Replacing an old hotel can remove poor conditions, but it can also remove the rooms poor residents depend upon. New investment can bring services, employment, and cleaner streets. It can also attract landlords who see long-time tenants as obstacles to higher profits. The Tenderloin has spent much of its history balancing between abandonment and displacement. Too little investment allows buildings and public spaces to deteriorate. Too much investment, directed only toward wealthier newcomers, can erase the community that survived the years of neglect. Residents understood this long before city planners began using careful language to describe it. By the late 20th century, neighbourhood activists fought to preserve affordable housing, protect single-room occupancy hotels, create parks, publish multilingual newspapers, establish health and social services, and demand that officials recognise the Tenderloin as a residential community rather than simply a zone of vice. Historical accounts describe a neighbourhood renaissance driven by residents, organisers and professionals determined to preserve a place where low-income people could continue to live. That activism grew from necessity. The Tenderloin was often spoken about by people who did not live there. Officials discussed it in meeting rooms. Newspapers sent reporters into it. Tour guides turned it into an unusual stop. Police departments created special operations. Business groups proposed improvement plans. Residents had to remind everyone that the area was not an empty project site. It was home. Children were growing up there. Immigrant families were opening businesses. Seniors were aging in hotel rooms. Musicians were rehearsing. Religious groups were serving meals. Tenants were organising against eviction. Queer and transgender residents were building networks of protection in a city that did not always protect them. The neighbourhood survival was not passive. It required people to defend buildings that outsiders considered worthless. It required arguments over rent, zoning, hotel conversion, policing, parks, food access, and public services. It required residents to attend meetings after work and explain their lives to officials who sometimes knew the Tenderloin mainly through reports. Even the language used to describe the area became contested. Was it a slum, an entertainment district, a residential neighbourhood, a containment zone, an immigrant gateway, a historic district, a queer refuge, an affordable housing resource, or a public health emergency? The honest answer is that it has been all of those things at different times, and sometimes several of them at once. Its history does not move neatly from bad conditions toward improvement. Progress arrived unevenly. One block could become safer while another lost affordable rooms. A new service might open while an old community space closed. Police pressure could reduce one activity and move it 2 streets away. A building renovation could save a structure and remove its tenants. This is why the Tenderloin frustrates simple explanations. People often expect a neighbourhood's history to have a clear lesson. They want to know which policy worked, which leader failed, which decade caused the decline, or which group deserves credit for recovery. The Tenderloin does not provide easy answers. It shows how urban problems accumulate when housing, policing, labour, health, immigration and political power intersect in the same confined space. It also shows how communities develop practical forms of survival when formal systems prove unreliable. Before it became associated with poverty and street disorder, the district had another identity. In the 19th century, portions of the area were connected with theatres, restaurants, hotels, and evening entertainment. It was once described as part of St Anne's Valley, and later became known as the Uptown Tenderloin. By the turn of the 20th century, the name carried associations with vice and police corruption, including the familiar explanation that officers assigned to the district could afford better cuts of meat because of bribes collected from illegal businesses. Whether every detail of that naming story is exact is less important than what the story tells us. People already understood the relationship between vice and authority. The illegal economy did not survive because the police could not find it. Much of it survived because officials, business owners, customers, and political organisations reached arrangements that allowed it to operate. Control did not always mean eliminating vice. Sometimes it meant deciding who could profit from it, where it could take place, and when enforcement would suddenly become useful. The Tenderloin was not outside government. Government was present everywhere. It was present in every licence issued, every raid announced, every payment overlooked, every hotel inspected, every street renamed, and every reform campaign launched before an election. That relationship began before the neighbourhood carried the reputation it has today. To see how it developed, we need to return to San Francisco before the tall apartment hotels, before the neon signs, before the jazz clubs, and before the name Tenderloin settled permanently over these streets. The ground beneath the district looked very different then. There were sandhills, rough paths, scattered structures, and an expanding city trying to shape itself after the sudden population explosion of the gold rush. Market Street had not yet become the hard dividing line people recognise today. Streets existed on maps before they functioned properly on the land. Development moved unevenly across dunes and low ground as investors, labourers, merchants and speculators tried to turn a chaotic settlement into a permanent city. The neighbourhood San Francisco could never control began in a period when San Francisco could barely control itself, and that earlier city is where we're going next. The neighbourhood San Francisco could never control began in a period when San Francisco could barely control itself. In 1846 the settlement was still called Yerba Buena. It was a small port with fewer than 1,000 residents. positioned near a sheltered cove on the northeastern side of the peninsula. The streets were limited, buildings were scattered, and much of the land beyond the waterfront remained open, uneven, and difficult to cross. Sand covered large sections of the landscape. Wind moved it from one place to another. Paths formed where people walked often enough, then disappeared beneath new drifts. The land now associated with the Tenderloin was not yet a neighbourhood. It stood beyond the compact settlement near the bay, separated from the busiest activity by distance, poor roads, and a physical landscape that did not cooperate with tidy plans. Some areas were low and marshy, others were covered by dunes, seasonal water collected in hollows. The western edge of the young town did not look like a natural place for dense urban development. It certainly did not look like the future centre of hotels, apartment houses, theatres, restaurants, churches, bars, and thousands of small rented rooms. Then gold was discovered in 1848. Within 2 years, San Francisco became one of the fastest growing cities in the world. Ships arrived, crowded with people who hoped to become rich. Sailors abandoned vessels in the harbour. Merchants opened temporary shops. Speculators bought land they had never seen. Tents, wooden houses, warehouses, saloons, lodging rooms, and gambling establishments appeared wherever owners could find space. The population grew too quickly for the existing town to absorb it. In 1848, San Francisco had perhaps 1,000 residents. By 1850, the federal census counted more than 25,000, and even that number probably failed to capture everyone passing through the city. The gold rush transformed a small settlement into a major commercial port before the basic systems of government, housing, sanitation, and transportation were ready. Streets existed on paper while remaining nearly impassable in practice. Property claims overlapped. Fires spread through tightly packed wooden buildings. Prices rose beyond anything newcomers had expected. The city pushed outward because it had no choice. Market Street became one of the most important lines in San Francisco's expansion. Surveyors had drawn it unusually wide, dividing the older street grid to the north from a different grid to the south. At first, it was not the great downtown avenue later generations would recognize. Large stretches were rough, muddy, sandy, and difficult to travel. The street was an intention before it became a functioning road. North of Market, the blocks that would later form the Tenderloin were gradually surveyed and offered for development. The street names were already familiar: Taylor, Jones, Leavenworth, Hyde, Larkin, Ellis, Eddy, Turk, and Geary. On a map, they suggested order. On the ground, order took longer. Survey lines did not remove sandhills. They did not drain low areas. They did not build sewers or make walking easy after rain. Early San Francisco repeatedly discovered that drawing a street and creating a street were different things. Property owners wanted access to their lots. City officials wanted taxable development. Contractors wanted grading work. Labourers wanted jobs. Over the following decades, hills were cut down, hollows were filled, and streets were levelled. Sand was moved in enormous quantities. In some places, buildings were raised or relocated as street grades changed around them. The physical city was being reshaped to fit a grid laid across land that had never been flat. This process was expensive, slow, and politically contentious. Owners frequently disagreed about who should pay for improvements. Contractors received public work through a system often influenced by personal relationships and political loyalty. The quality of grading and paving varied. Rain turned unfinished streets into mud. Dry weather produced dust. Horse-drawn vehicles struggled on steep or loose surfaces. The future Tenderloin developed within this unstable environment. In the earliest years after the gold rush, wealth concentrated near the waterfront and along the commercial streets closest to it. Merchants, banks, warehouses, shipping offices, hotels, saloons, and gambling rooms served the constant flow of people arriving and leaving. Residential development moved westward and uphill as the city became more permanent. Not everyone wanted to live beside the noise and congestion of the port. Successful merchants and professionals began building houses away from the waterfront. The blocks north and west of Market offered space close enough to business districts, but far enough from the crowded docks. As streets improved, portions of the area became residential. Wooden houses appeared beside boarding establishments, small shops, stables, churches, and vacant lots. The name most often connected with the district before Tenderloin was St. Anne's Valley. The exact boundaries of St. Anne's Valley were never perfectly fixed. San Francisco neighborhood names often developed through common use rather than formal designation, and residents did not always agree about where one ended and another began. The name was associated with a low area north of Market Street, and with St. Anne's Church, a Catholic institution that served the growing population. Accounts of 19th century San Francisco describe St. Anne's Valley as a district that included residences, entertainment, restaurants, and public gathering places before the area became known as the Uptown Tenderloin. The word valley made more sense in the 19th century than it does today. Modern streets and buildings conceal much of the original topography. Before extensive grading, the land dipped between higher ground. A person walking through the area would have noticed elevation changes, open patches and sand-covered slopes that no longer appear clearly beneath the dense city blocks. For a time, the district stood between several different versions of San Francisco. To the east was the expanding commercial city. To the west were developing residential areas. To the north, hills rose toward neighborhoods associated with greater wealth. South of Market lay workshops, warehouses, boarding houses, and industrial activity. The future Tenderloin occupied a useful middle position. That position encouraged mixed development. A family might live beside a boarding house. A stable could stand near a church. A restaurant might open across from a modest residence. Small theatres and drinking places could operate close to hotels. The neighbourhood was not planned around a single class or purpose. It grew through individual decisions made lot by lot. This lack of a single identity would remain one of its defining characteristics. San Francisco's population was heavily male during the gold rush years. Thousands of miners, sailors, labourers, merchants, clerks, and adventurers arrived without families. They needed beds, meals, laundry, alcohol, entertainment, and companionship. Many stayed in hotels or boarding houses rather than private homes. The demand for temporary lodging changed the shape of the city. Rooms could be profitable even when they were small. Houses were divided. Boarding establishments expanded. Landlords learned that a building close to employment and entertainment could earn money from a constant turnover of tenants. The residents did not need gardens, large parlours, or private dining rooms. They needed a place to sleep and somewhere to store a few possessions. This pattern would eventually become central to the Tenderloin, but its foundations appeared long before the neighbourhood received that name. The people renting rooms came from many backgrounds. Irish immigrants formed a major part of San Francisco's working population. Germans, French, Italians, Mexicans, Chileans, Chinese migrants, Australians, British sailors, and people from Eastern American states entered the city in large numbers. Racial discrimination, anti-immigrant politics, and restrictive practices limited where certain groups could live and work. Chinese residents faced particularly severe hostility. They were attacked in the press, excluded from many occupations, targeted by discriminatory taxes and laws, and subjected to violence. Most were concentrated close to Chinatown, but the broader system of exclusion shaped development throughout central San Francisco. Neighborhoods did not grow from free choice alone. They were also produced by rules, prejudices, employment patterns, and the decisions of landlords. The early district north of Market was not yet the primary refuge for the communities that would later define parts of the Tenderloin. Still, the city was already establishing the habit of sorting people geographically. Respectability had an address. Wealthier residents wanted distance from industries, crowded lodging houses, and commercial amusements. Families concerned about social position preferred streets associated with private homes and churches. Activities considered noisy, immoral, or disreputable tended to collect where rents were lower, and enforcement was flexible. The future Tenderloin lay close enough to attract customers from respectable areas without requiring those activities to operate directly among the most expensive homes. Transportation strengthened this advantage. Before cable cars and electric streetcars transformed San Francisco, movement depended on walking, horses, carriages, and early horse-drawn street railways. Distance mattered. A person who worked downtown could not easily live several miles away unless there was reliable transportation. As streetcar lines expanded during the second half of the 19th century, central neighborhoods became more accessible. Market Street developed into a transportation spine. Lines carried passengers through downtown and toward growing districts farther west. The blocks north of Market benefited immediately. Workers could reach offices, shops, theatres, warehouses, and government buildings. Visitors staying in hotels could travel without hiring a carriage. Entertainment businesses could draw customers from other parts of the city. Property near major routes became more valuable, but the small lots and mixture of uses encouraged density rather than the spacious development found in some wealthier districts. The neighbourhood's physical form began to take shape. Buildings stood close together. Many were made of wood, the most common and affordable construction material in 19th century San Francisco. Narrow facades faced the street. Rear buildings and additions increased the number of rentable spaces. Bay windows provided light while extending living space over the sidewalk line. Ground floors often held commercial businesses, with rooms or apartments above. Fire was a constant threat. San Francisco suffered a series of major fires during the early gold rush period. Dense wooden construction, strong winds, limited water supplies, and basic firefighting equipment allowed flames to spread quickly. After each disaster, rebuilding began almost immediately. The city introduced regulations intended to reduce risk, particularly in the commercial core, but enforcement was uneven. Brick construction cost more. Wood remained practical and widely available. Owners frequently chose immediate profit over long-term safety. The future Tenderloin inherited this building culture. Many structures were altered repeatedly, expanded, divided, and adapted to new uses. A private home might become a boarding house. A boarding house might add a saloon on the ground floor. A small hotel might absorb the neighbouring property. Buildings rarely remained what their original owners intended. The same was true of the streets. Geary Street became an important route westward. Market Street grew busier. Larkin and Hyde connected central districts with areas farther north. The neighbourhood's accessibility made it attractive not only to residents but also to businesses serving people after work. By the 1860s and 1870s, San Francisco was no longer a temporary mining port. It was the commercial centre of the Pacific coast, connected to global shipping networks, and, after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, to the rest of the United States by rail. Railroad wealth changed the city. The men known as the Big Four, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, built enormous fortunes through the Central Pacific Railroad. Banks, insurance companies, shipping firms, manufacturers and wholesalers expanded. The city developed a class of wealthy residents eager to display their success. Nob Hill became the most visible symbol of that wealth. Mansions rose above downtown. The location allowed rich families to live physically and socially above the crowded commercial districts. Only a short distance away, the blocks that would become the Tenderloin developed in another direction. They were not poor in the way later generations would understand the neighbourhood, but they were denser, more commercial, and more open to public entertainment. Hotels and restaurants served visitors. Theatres drew evening crowds. Saloons provided meeting places for businessmen, workers, political organisations, and travellers. The proximity between wealth and entertainment was not accidental. Residents of Nob Hill and other prosperous districts did not need to travel far to reach restaurants, theatres, drinking establishments or gambling rooms. Businessmen working downtown could stop in the district before returning home. Visitors could stay near transportation and nightlife. A neighbourhood of mixed respectability was commercially valuable. The term vice district can create the impression of a place separated from ordinary life, but 19th century urban vice depended on ordinary customers. Gambling rooms needed clerks, merchants, labourers, tourists, and wealthy men willing to spend money. Saloons depended on workers and political groups. Sex work existed because customers from across the city sought it. The neighbourhood did not corrupt an innocent San Francisco. It served desires already present throughout San Francisco. Municipal politics helped organise those desires. During the 19th century, saloons were central to political life. They provided places where men gathered, exchanged information, found work, and met local political organisers. Ward leaders and party officials built support through personal favours. A man might receive help finding a job, resolving a legal problem, or obtaining city assistance. In return, he was expected to vote correctly and encourage others to do the same. Police officers operated within this political system. Appointments and promotions could depend on connections. Enforcement was selective. Businesses that violated moral or licensing laws sometimes survived through payments, friendships, or political protection. These relationships existed across San Francisco, but they became especially important in entertainment districts. The city could announce rules against gambling, prostitution, unlicensed drinking, or disorderly houses. Yet complete enforcement would have closed businesses that produced money, employment, political donations, and private benefits for officials. The result was not an absence of control. It was negotiated control. A business might remain open as long as the owner paid the correct people, avoided excessive public attention, and obeyed unwritten boundaries. A reform campaign could suddenly disrupt the arrangement. Raids would follow. Newspapers would celebrate a crackdown. Some businesses closed temporarily, only to reopen later under different names or managers. This pattern was already developing before the Tenderloin name arrived from New York. Meanwhile, the ordinary residential life of the area continued. Children attended nearby schools, families shopped in local stores, churches offered services in different languages. Women took in laundry, rented rooms, performed domestic labour, managed boarding houses, and worked in the entertainment economy. Men found employment as cooks, waiters, bartenders, stable workers, drivers, clerks, musicians, labourers, and hotel staff. The district did not shut down when the theatres closed. Breakfast had to be prepared. Floors had to be cleaned. Coal and wood had to be delivered. Horses had to be fed. Linens had to be washed. Rooms had to be made ready for new guests. Businesses that appeared glamorous at night depended on exhausting work performed during the day. A hotel guest might see a bright dining room and a polished entrance. Behind that appearance were kitchens, storage areas, narrow sleeping rooms for staff, and long hours of physical labour. This difference between the public face and the hidden machinery of the neighbourhood would continue throughout its history. Toward the end of the 19th century, San Francisco grew more confident about its status. Civic leaders wanted the city to be recognized as a modern American metropolis rather than a rough gold rush settlement. They promoted new public buildings, improved streets, grand hotels, parks, theatres, and cultural institutions. Respectability became a civic project. Yet the city's prosperity continued to depend on industries and activities that did not fit the official image. Sailors, migrant labourers, domestic workers, hotel employees, performers, and sex workers remained essential to the economy. Cheap lodging remained necessary. Nightlife attracted visitors and local spending. The district north of Market offered a place where these parts of urban life could remain close to downtown. By the 1890s, it was becoming known for restaurants, theatres, cafes, lodging houses and nightlife. The term St. Anne's Valley had not vanished, but another identity was forming. The area was increasingly compared to New York's Tenderloin district, already famous for theatres, gambling, prostitution, police corruption and expensive restaurants. The National Register documentation for the Uptown Tenderloin identifies the district's later significance through its architecture and social history, with the area developing into one of the city's major concentrations of hotels and apartment buildings during the 20th century. That built environment came later, especially after the earthquake and fire of 1906, but the social conditions that produced it were already present before the disaster. The neighbourhood had become central, accessible, mixed, and commercially active. It sat beside wealth without belonging to wealth. It served visitors without becoming a tourist district alone. It housed families, but was not exclusively residential. It offered entertainment while supporting a large workforce that remained mostly invisible. It was watched by police and protected by corruption at the same time. When the name Tenderloin finally became common, it did not create this character. It gave a familiar label to a set of arrangements San Francisco had spent decades building. The popular explanation for the name begins with a police captain in New York. According to the often repeated story, an officer transferred into a district filled with profitable vice announced that he would now be able to eat tenderloin rather than cheaper meat, because the opportunities for bribes were so much greater. The story later became attached to similar districts in other American cities. San Francisco's Uptown Tenderloin earned the name because people recognized the same relationship among entertainment, illegal business, police authority, and private profit. The explanation may have been repeated and improved over time, but its survival reveals how openly the public understood the system. Found SF's historical account notes both the earlier name St. Anne's Valley and the traditional claim that police assigned to the district could afford better cuts of meat through bribes collected from vice businesses. Before the nickname settled over the map, the essential pieces were already in place. The streets had been graded across sand and low ground. Transportation connected the area to downtown. Hotels and boarding houses served a mobile population. Restaurants and theatres drew crowds. Saloons linked business, labour and politics. Selective enforcement allowed forbidden activities to operate near respectable districts. Nothing about this development was inevitable, but each decision made the next one easier. A city had grown faster than its institutions. A central district had developed without a single controlling purpose. Officials had learned to regulate vice without eliminating it. Property owners had discovered the value of small rooms and temporary tenants. Customers had learned that they could enter the district, purchase what they wanted, and return to respectable lives elsewhere. The Tenderloin did not begin with a dramatic declaration. No official stood on a corner and announced that these blocks would become San Francisco's protected zone of pleasure, corruption, and social contradiction. It happened gradually. One hotel opened beside another. A saloon attracted a political organisation. A theatre brought crowds after dark. A boarding house divided its rooms. A police officer decided not to notice a business. A customer crossed Market Street and found that the rules felt different only a few blocks from home. By the time San Franciscans began calling the area the Tenderloin, the city had already created a neighbourhood where vice was not an accident, and where control depended less on stopping forbidden activity than on deciding who would be allowed to benefit from it. By the time San Franciscans began using the name Tenderloin, the neighbourhood already possessed the arrangement that would define it for generations. It offered pleasure, anonymity, employment, cheap rooms, political influence, and private profit within walking distance of the city's most respectable institutions. The police knew where the gambling rooms were. Officials knew which restaurants offered more than food. Newspaper editors knew which streets would provide an easy scandal. Customers knew how to enter the district without explaining why they had come. Vice survived there because too many people found it useful. That usefulness extended far beyond the men and women who operated illegal businesses. Landlords collected rent from establishments that could pay more than an ordinary shop. Bartenders, waiters, musicians, cooks, cleaners, drivers, performers, and hotel workers earned wages from the evening economy. Political organisations found supporters in saloons. Newspapers sold copies by condemning behaviour they described in careful detail. Police officers could turn selective enforcement into income. Reformers built public careers by promising to eliminate conditions that previous reform campaigns had failed to remove. The Tenderloin was not a place where government disappeared. It was a place where formal rules and informal agreements operated at the same time. Officially, gambling, prostitution, and various forms of public disorder were prohibited or restricted. In practice, the law was applied according to circumstance. A business might be tolerated for months, then raided after a complaint appeared in the press. Another might remain open because its owner had useful political contacts. Officers could enforce closing hours against one saloon, while ignoring a nearly identical establishment nearby. Everyone involved understood that legality was not the only issue. The more important questions were who owned the business, who received payment, who complained, and whether the activity remained discreet enough to avoid embarrassing the city. The popular explanation for the neighbourhood's name expressed this understanding plainly. The term had already been applied to a vice district in New York, where an assignment was said to provide police officers enough illicit income to afford tenderloin steak instead of cheaper meat. San Francisco adopted the label for its own district because the connection between police protection and profitable vice was familiar. Historical accounts of the neighbourhood repeat the explanation that officers assigned there could improve their standard of living through payments from gambling houses, brothels, and other businesses. The story may have changed as it was repeated, but no one needed it to be literally true for the joke to work. San Franciscans already believed that certain police assignments came with opportunities. A district filled with saloons, restaurants, gambling rooms, lodging houses, and sex work created a market for protection. Owners paid because the alternative was unpredictable enforcement. Officers accepted because low official wages could be supplemented through the authority of the badge. Protection did not always involve a direct envelope of cash handed across a table. It could take many forms. A restaurant might provide free meals. A saloon owner might contribute to a political campaign. A hotel operator could offer a room, information, or favours. A police officer might warn a business before a raid, allowing evidence to disappear and customers to leave. The arrangement worked best when it remained ordinary. A spectacular act of corruption attracted attention. A small payment repeated every week became part of the operating cost of a business. No one needed to discuss the larger system because each participant dealt only with the person directly in front of him. The city's political structure encouraged this pattern. San Francisco in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was governed through strong personal networks. Saloons served as neighbourhood headquarters, where political organisers met voters, distributed favours, and gathered information. Jobs in public departments could depend on party loyalty. Contractors sought municipal work through influence as well as competitive ability. Police officers were not separate from this culture. They were appointed, promoted, and disciplined within a political environment. An officer who interfered with a protected business could create problems for his superiors. One who understood the local arrangement could become valuable. This did not mean that every officer was corrupt or that every illegal business enjoyed permanent protection. It meant that the system made consistent enforcement difficult and selective enforcement profitable. The neighbourhood's restaurants played a particularly important role because they allowed vice to present itself in respectable clothing. San Francisco developed a reputation for dining and nightlife early in its history. Visitors expected restaurants that remained open late. Businessmen wanted private rooms where they could eat, drink, negotiate, gamble, and meet companions away from public attention. Some establishments known as French restaurants provided elaborate meals on the ground floor and more private services upstairs. The food gave customers a reason to enter. The private rooms supplied the greater profit. A man could tell his family or business associates that he had gone to dinner. He would not necessarily be lying. He simply would not be describing the entire evening. These restaurants blurred the line between legal and illegal activity. Serving meals was legitimate. Selling alcohol was legitimate when properly licensed. Renting private rooms was not automatically a crime. The difficulty for reformers was proving what else happened and whether the owner knowingly permitted it. Police protection made that proof even harder. The municipal corruption investigation that followed the 1906 earthquake later identified the French restaurant cases as examples of what investigators called police graft, protection for illicit or demoralising enterprises. The official report grouped those cases with a broader system of bribery that involved city supervisors, political boss Abraham Roof, Mayor Eugene Schmitz, public service corporations and valuable municipal privileges. This is important because it prevents us from treating Tenderloin vice as an isolated moral problem. The same government that tolerated prostitution and gambling also negotiated streetcar franchises, utility rates, telephone privileges, and development rights through corrupt arrangements. The scale differed, but the principle was similar. Public authority could be converted into private income. A police officer controlled whether a business was disturbed. A supervisor controlled whether a company received a valuable franchise. A political boss connected the people who wanted favours with the officials able to provide them. The Tenderloin was one part of a citywide economy of access. Abraham Roof became the central figure in that system. A lawyer, political organiser and powerful Republican boss, he built influence through his control of the Union Labour Party and his relationship with Mayor Schmitz. Roof was not simply a neighbourhood fixer. He operated at the level of major corporations and municipal government. The scandal that eventually surrounded him revealed bribery involving utility companies, streetcar interests, telephone franchises, and members of the Board of Supervisors. Investigators later described dozens of indictments and a political culture in which officials exchanged public decisions for private payment. The Tenderloin fitted naturally into that structure. Its businesses needed licenses, protection, and predictable policing. Political leaders needed votes, donations, and loyal organisations. The district's saloons and restaurants offered meeting places where these interests could overlap. A reformer looking at the neighbourhood saw vice. A political boss saw a network. The difference helps explain why moral campaigns produce dramatic raids, but rarely permanent change. Closing one gambling room did not remove the customers. Arresting a group of sex workers did not remove the demand for their services. Revoking one liquor licence did not change the political importance of saloons. Unless the city altered the economic and political relationships supporting the businesses, new operators could take the place of the old ones. The district also benefited from geography. It stood near hotels serving visitors who arrived with money and few local ties. It was close to theatres that released crowds late at night. It remained accessible from wealthy neighbourhoods and downtown offices. A customer could enter the Tenderloin, spend several hours there and leave without requiring accommodation inside the district. This outside demand was essential. Public discussion often described vice as though it were produced by the people living in the neighbourhood. Yet many customers came from elsewhere. They returned afterward to homes and districts that maintained cleaner reputations. The Tenderloin carried the shame for transactions that involved the entire city. This arrangement protected respectable society from having to examine itself too closely. A married businessman did not need to question the social values of his own neighbourhood if the brothel he visited was blamed on the Tenderloin. A politician did not need to admit that nightlife contributed to the city's economy if he could call for periodic crackdowns. A newspaper could present vice as the behaviour of a dangerous district, rather than the result of ordinary demand. The neighbourhood became a container for public hypocrisy. Women working in prostitution paid the highest price for that hypocrisy. Their circumstances varied. Some entered the trade voluntarily because it offered a better income than domestic service, factory work or laundry labour. Others were pushed into it by poverty, abuse, abandonment, coercion, debt, or limited employment opportunities. Immigrant women and women of colour faced additional discrimination that narrowed their choices. The city treated them as both necessary and disposable. Customers arrived from every social class, but enforcement concentrated on the women who could be seen and arrested. Brothel owners, landlords, police officers, and political protectors often remained less exposed. A raid could produce a row of female defendants, while the larger economic structure continued untouched. The double standard was obvious to people living inside the system. Men could enter a house of prostitution and return to respectable lives. Women discovered they could be permanently marked by the association. A man's visit was treated as a private weakness. A woman's work became her entire public identity. Reform organisations often described prostitutes as victims in need of rescue, but rescue was rarely accompanied by enough money, housing, childcare, or employment to make leaving possible. That failure would become painfully visible in 1917, when hundreds of women confronted a minister leading a campaign to close the city's vice districts. The event came later than the period we are now following, but it revealed a problem that had existed from the beginning. Closing a brothel did not answer the question of how its workers would survive. Before that confrontation, waves of reform repeatedly passed through San Francisco. Religious organizations held meetings and sent workers into vice districts. Civic groups demanded stricter licensing. Grand juries toured streets associated with prostitution and gambling. Newspapers published exposés. Police chiefs promised enforcement. The campaigns produced public scenes. Officers entered establishments. Furniture and gambling equipment were seized. Women were taken into custody. Owners appeared in court. Ministers announced progress. Then attention shifted. Businesses reopened, moved, or changed names. Payments were rearranged. Police leadership changed. A new administration adopted a different policy. The district adjusted. This cycle made reform itself part of the neighbourhood economy. Politicians could use vice campaigns to demonstrate authority. Newspapers gained dramatic material. Religious leaders attracted audiences. Police departments justified larger budgets. Business owners who survived a crackdown faced less competition afterward. Even the destruction of vice could create new opportunities for someone else. The Tenderloin's relationship with nightlife also complicated reform. Not every late-night business was illegal. Theatres, cafes, music halls, restaurants and hotels formed a legitimate entertainment district. They provided jobs and attracted visitors. A complete assault on nightlife would damage legal businesses along with illegal ones. Owners understood this and used respectability as protection. A cafe could describe itself as a dining establishment. A dance hall could claim to offer harmless recreation. A hotel could deny knowledge of what tenants did in private rooms. The neighbourhood's density made strict separation impossible. A theatre stood near a saloon. A restaurant shared a wall with a lodging house. Musicians moved from legitimate stages to more questionable establishments. Customers travelled between them during the same evening. Moral categories that appeared clear in a sermon became less clear on the street. Consider one ordinary Saturday night around the turn of the 20th century. A theatre audience leaves after a performance. Couples and groups move onto the sidewalks. Some return home. Others enter restaurants. Hotel guests ask clerks where they might find music or a drink. Bartenders begin their busiest hours. Cooks prepare late meals. Waiters carry trays into private rooms. A police officer walks the beat. He knows which doors lead to gambling. He recognises the men who manage the houses. He knows which establishments have been warned about noise and which have received protection from someone above him. He may genuinely intervene when violence occurs. He may escort an intoxicated customer away from a doorway. He may also ignore an offence because enforcement would disturb an accepted arrangement. The same officer can preserve order and participate in corruption during the same shift. That contradiction was common because vice districts required a certain level of control to remain profitable. Business owners did not want uncontrolled violence outside their doors. They wanted customers to feel safe enough to spend money. They needed police assistance when someone refused to pay, damage property, or threaten staff. The police and illegal businesses were therefore not simple enemies. They could be partners until politics required them to appear as opponents. Public order in the Tenderloin meant keeping disorder within limits. Gambling could continue as long as it remained discreet. Sex work could operate as long as complaints did not reach influential residents. Drinking could remain loud, but not so violent that newspapers demanded action. The purpose was not moral purity. It was stability. That stability repeatedly broke down because the system contained too many competing interests. Owners disputed payments. Officers demanded more money. Reformers exposed protected businesses. Political factions used scandals against one another. Violence attracted attention. A new police chief decided to demonstrate independence. Each disruption revealed pieces of the hidden arrangement. The graft prosecutions of the early 20th century offered the clearest view. The city-appointed report that followed condemned corruption throughout municipal government and stated that the crimes uncovered by the Oliver Grand jury included police graft, franchise graft, and rate graft. It also criticised the police department for failing to uncover the crimes, and noted that the police chief himself had been indicted for perjury and conspiracy to prevent detection. The language was severe because the investigators believed corruption had become structural. They were not describing a few dishonest officers taking small payments. They were describing a government in which protection, privilege, and political influence had become organised. Still, exposing the system did not eliminate the forces that created it. San Francisco remained a port city filled with temporary workers, sailors, travellers, and young unmarried men. It remained a convention and entertainment destination. Hotels continued to need guests. Restaurants continued to compete for evening business. Customers continued to seek gambling, alcohol, and sex. As long as officials prohibited activities that remained profitable, someone would offer protection. As long as police possessed discretion, that discretion could be sold. As long as respectable customers expected anonymity, the city would benefit from maintaining a district where their behaviour could be separated from their public identity. Vice was never an accident because it solved too many problems for powerful people. It provided revenue without requiring public approval. It created employment without requiring respectable employers. It gave political organisations gathering places and money. It allowed police authority to become a private asset. It offered customers freedom while concentrating punishment on workers and residents with less power. The neighbourhood did not exist beyond the moral order of San Francisco. It exposed how that moral order actually worked. Publicly, the city celebrated family, business, discipline, and progress. Privately, it maintained a district where the desires excluded from that image could be purchased. The arrangement might have continued with gradual changes if the physical city had remained intact. Instead, at 5:12 on the morning of April 18th, 1906, the ground moved with enough force to break streets, collapse buildings, rupture water lines, and begin a fire that would erase much of central San Francisco. The earthquake did not distinguish between respectable and disreputable property. Mansions, churches, hotels, saloons, offices, and private houses stood beneath the same shaking ground. The fires that followed moved across the city according to wind, fuel, and failed firefighting decisions rather than moral reputation. Within days, much of the landscape that had supported the old Tenderloin was gone. The people, businesses, habits, and political relationships survived, however, and when rebuilding began, San Francisco created a denser neighbourhood with more hotels, more apartments, more entertainment, and more opportunities for the same arrangements to return in a different form. The people, businesses, habits, and political relationships survived, and when rebuilding began, San Francisco created a denser neighbourhood with more hotels, more apartments, more entertainment, and more opportunities for the same arrangements to return in a different form. At 5:12 on the morning of the April 18th, 1906, most of San Francisco was still asleep. Night workers were returning home. Bakers had begun preparing bread. Hotel clerks were watching the final hours of their shifts. Restaurant kitchens had gone quiet. In rented rooms throughout the district north of Market Street, tenants slept only a short distance from some of the city's wealthiest homes and busiest commercial buildings. Then the ground began to move. The earthquake lasted for less than a minute, but it was long enough to damage buildings across Northern California and break a section of the San Andreas Fault extending for nearly 300 miles. Modern estimates place its magnitude near 7.8. In San Francisco, chimneys fell, brick walls collapsed, windows shattered, gas lines broke, and streets opened in places where the ground beneath them was unstable. People woke to the sound of plaster falling and furniture moving across floors. Some ran into the street without shoes. Others remained inside doorways, uncertain whether staircases were safe. Hotel guests unfamiliar with the city followed employees toward exits. Residents of wooden houses heard walls strain and foundations shift. In brick buildings, loose masonry fell into rooms and onto sidewalks. The shaking itself was severe, but it did not destroy most of San Francisco. The fires did that. Broken gas pipes and overturned stoves started dozens of blazes. Water mains had ruptured, leaving firefighters without enough pressure in their hoses. Streets were blocked by debris. Telephone service failed. Fire crews lost the ability to coordinate across the city. Small fires that might normally have been contained began joining into larger ones. Over the next 3 days, flames burned through almost 5 square miles and destroyed more than 28,000 buildings. More than 3,000 people are now believed to have died, and roughly 225,000 residents were left without homes. The disaster did not arrive as one continuous wall of fire. It moved through the city in separate fronts. Residents watched smoke rise from one direction and tried to decide whether they had time to save their possessions. Rumours passed along the streets faster than reliable information. One person heard that the fire had been stopped. Another heard that the entire downtown district was lost. Families packed trunks, then abandoned them when the roads became too crowded. People carried blankets, photographs, account books, food, tools, and anything else they could manage. Some tried to move furniture. For a few hours, the streets filled with people dragging trunks, pushing carts, leading horses, and carrying mattresses. Property owners hired wagons at rapidly increasing prices. Those without money carried what they could and left the rest behind. The difference between wealth and poverty remained visible even during the emergency. A wealthy household might employ servants and rent a vehicle to remove valuables. A hotel resident might have only a suitcase. A worker living in a furnished room could lose nearly everything simply because there was no secure place to take it. Fire reduced those differences in one sense. Mansions, boarding houses, churches, saloons, office buildings, restaurants and private homes could all burn. It did not reduce them in every sense. People with money had relatives, bank accounts, insurance and options elsewhere. Those who had already been living close to poverty entered the disaster with fewer resources and fewer ways to recover. The area that would become the modern Tenderloin stood close to the path of destruction. Portions of the district burned, and many neighbouring areas were devastated. City Hall, located only a short walk away, was badly damaged. Its ruined dome and broken walls became one of the most recognisable images of the catastrophe. The destruction of City Hall carried a meaning beyond physical damage. The building had been expensive, slow to construct, and widely associated with municipal corruption. When much of it collapsed, observers saw not only the power of the earthquake, but also evidence of dishonest construction and failed government. A city already known for political graft now had to manage one of the largest urban disasters in American history. Mayor Eugene Schmitz issued orders intended to prevent looting. soldiers and police patrolled the streets. One widely repeated order authorised the shooting of looters, although the actual legal status and enforcement of such commands were uncertain. Armed authority appeared throughout the city while residents were still trying to understand whether their homes would survive. The presence of soldiers reassured some people and frightened others. Military units guarded banks, warehouses, and damaged commercial districts. They directed crowds and attempted to keep roads clear. They also enforced emergency rules with little opportunity for appeal. In the confusion, property rights, personal safety, and official power became difficult to separate. One of the most controversial firefighting methods involved dynamite. Officials and military personnel attempted to create fire breaks by blowing up buildings ahead of the flames. In theory, removing structures would deprive the fire of fuel. In practice, many demolitions were poorly planned. Explosions scattered burning material, damaged buildings that might otherwise have survived, and in some cases started new fires. Residents watched officials destroy property in the hope of saving the next block. The decisions had to be made quickly, but speed did not guarantee competence. San Francisco's emergency response combined courage, improvisation, confusion, and serious mistakes. Firefighters worked without sleep. Residents formed bucket lines. Sailors and soldiers moved equipment. People used water from cisterns, wells, and any other source they could find. At the waterfront, fireboats pumped water from the bay. In some areas, crews managed to stop the flames. In others, wind and broken water systems made resistance nearly impossible. By April 21st, the major fires had ended. Much of the city's commercial and residential centre had become a landscape of standing chimneys, twisted metal, burned brick and ash. Survivors walked back toward their neighbourhoods and struggled to identify familiar streets. Landmarks had disappeared. Buildings that once defined a corner were gone. The street grid remained, but the city attached to it had been removed. Photographs taken after the disaster show people walking through ruins with the careful posture of visitors, even when the destroyed buildings had been their own homes. They stopped to look at safes, walls, staircases, and fragments of furniture. The scale of destruction was too large to understand all at once. The city's immediate problem was shelter. Parks, military grounds, open lots, and unburned streets filled with refugees. Tents appeared in Golden Gate Park, the Presidio, and smaller public spaces. A refugee camp also stood near the damaged City Hall, placing displaced residents beside the ruins of municipal government. Food had to be distributed quickly. Army commissaries, charitable organisations, churches and volunteers established kitchens and bread lines. Residents waited for meals with containers in their hands. Water was rationed. Sanitation became urgent because damaged sewers and crowded camps created the risk of disease. The camps developed rules and routines. People registered for assistance. Officials assigned tents or temporary cottages. Cooking was organised. Latrines were dug. Medical care was provided where possible. Notices helped families locate missing relatives. Mail services gradually returned. The refugees were not treated equally. Race, class, and immigration status affected access to relief. Chinese residents faced the added threat that city officials might use the destruction of Chinatown as an opportunity to relocate them permanently. Chinatown occupied valuable land near downtown, and some business and political leaders had long wanted the community removed. The earthquake gave those leaders a chance to describe forced relocation as urban improvement. Chinese residents, merchants, diplomats, and property owners resisted. They used legal rights, economic influence, international pressure, and the fact that many owned or leased property within the old district. Their return prevented the city from simply erasing Chinatown from the map. The episode established a pattern that would later appear in the Tenderloin. Disaster and redevelopment were never only about buildings. They were also arguments about who had the right to return. San Francisco promoted an image of collective endurance, but recovery involved conflict from the beginning. Property owners wanted permission to rebuild. Insurers disputed claims. Tenants searched for rooms in a city that had lost an enormous share of its housing. Labourers demanded wages that reflected the sudden need for construction. Business leaders feared that companies and residents would relocate permanently to Oakland or other cities. The pressure to rebuild was intense. Within days, newspapers and officials announced that San Francisco would rise again. The language was confident because confidence itself had economic value. Banks needed depositors to remain calm. Investors needed to believe land still had value. Employers needed workers to stay. Residents needed a reason not to leave. Railroads carried many refugees out of the city without charge. More than 100,000 people passed through Oakland during the evacuation, and some continued to other parts of California or the country. Those who stayed entered a housing market transformed overnight. Unburned rooms became valuable. Houses took in relatives, friends, and strangers. Vacant land acquired temporary structures. Some residents lived in tents for months. Others moved into small earthquake cottages built through relief programs. The demand for permanent housing encouraged rapid construction. This mattered greatly for the future Tenderloin. The district was close to downtown, transportation, theatres, and the government centre. Its location made it ideal for hotels and apartment buildings designed for people who wanted central housing without maintaining a large private home. Before 1906, much of the area contained wooden houses and lower density structures. After the fire, developers had an opportunity to replace damaged buildings with taller and more profitable ones. The result was not a carefully planned neighbourhood built according to one design. It was a construction boom driven by individual owners, lenders, architects, contractors, and the urgent demand for rooms. Brick and reinforced concrete became more common. New building codes attempted to improve fire safety. Apartment houses and residential hotels filled lots that had once held smaller structures. Many of these buildings were several stories high, with narrow street fronts and long interior corridors. Rooms faced either the street, a rear yard, or a light well. Ground floors contained shops, restaurants, bars, theatres, and hotel lobbies. Fire escapes ran down exterior walls. Decorative cornices and entrance canopies gave even modest hotels an appearance of dignity. Developers used names suggesting elegance, travel, or European sophistication. A building might be called the Cadillac, the Granada, the Senator, the Ambassador, or the Bristol. The names did not always reflect the size of the rooms. They reflected the image owners wanted to sell. Residential hotels offered an important alternative between a boarding house and a private apartment. Some rooms included bathrooms, others shared facilities. Certain buildings provided meals, cleaning, and telephone service. Others offered only a furnished room. Weekly or monthly payment allowed tenants to remain without taking on a long lease. The customers included travelling salesmen, clerks, performers, unmarried workers, retired people, widows, couples without children, and visitors staying for an uncertain length of time. This population was well suited to central San Francisco. A clerk could walk to an office, a waiter could live near a restaurant, a performer could reach theatres without a long streetcar journey, a traveller could stay near rail connections and downtown businesses. The new buildings increased density while preserving flexibility. That flexibility would later make the Tenderloin one of the city's most important sources of low-cost housing. In the years immediately after the earthquake, however, many of the hotels were modern and commercially ambitious. Their lobbies were furnished. Their advertisements emphasized hot water, telephones, steam heat, elevators, and proximity to entertainment. The neighborhood emerging from the ruins was not yet described mainly as a place of decline. It was part of the rebuilt city. San Francisco reconstructed at remarkable speed. A Library of Congress map produced 2 years after the disaster showed extensive new construction throughout the burned area, confirming how rapidly buildings returned to the street grid. Speed brought problems. Contractors faced pressure to finish quickly. Owners borrowed heavily. Some buildings were constructed with the expectation that rents would remain high. The city wanted visible evidence of recovery before every underlying issue had been resolved. The old political networks also returned. Abraham Roof and Mayor Schmitz faced prosecution during the period of rebuilding, but removing particular men did not remove the relationships connecting business, nightlife, policing, and government. Licenses still had value. Building permits still created opportunities. Police officers still possessed discretion. Entertainment businesses still needed protection from sudden enforcement. The physical city changed more rapidly than the political habits within it. Nightlife returned because demand had survived the fire. Workers rebuilding downtown wanted places to eat and drink. Business travellers arrived to negotiate contracts. Property owners, architects and suppliers met in restaurants. Theatres reopened. Hotels filled with visitors who wanted to see the destroyed city, and later the city under construction. Even ruins became an attraction. Tour operators carried visitors through burned districts. Photographers sold images of destruction. Souvenir dealers offered pieces of melted glass, twisted metal, and printed books describing the disaster. San Francisco converted catastrophe into commerce before the ash had fully disappeared. The Tenderloin benefited from the returning crowds. Its position near Market Street, Union Square, and the theatre district made it suitable for evening businesses. Restaurants reopened or moved into new buildings. Saloons returned. Music could be heard from establishments that had not existed before the earthquake. The rebuilt neighbourhood gradually acquired the title Uptown Tenderloin. Uptown distinguished it from the older downtown vice district known as the Barbary Coast. The Barbary Coast lay closer to the waterfront and carried a rough reputation associated with sailors, dance halls, cheap saloons, robbery and prostitution. The Uptown Tenderloin presented a somewhat different face. Its customers included businessmen, theatre-goers, tourists, hotel guests, and middle-class residents seeking entertainment. Its restaurants could be expensive. Its clubs could appear fashionable. Illegal activities remained, but they were often hidden behind respectable entrances and commercial services. The rebuilt architecture supported that arrangement. A multi-story hotel offered anonymity. Guests entered and left constantly. Private rooms were available above restaurants and bars. Staff members learned not to ask unnecessary questions. Elevators and side entrances allowed people to move through buildings without remaining visible from the street. Density made observation easier for police, but also made enforcement more complicated. A single block could contain hundreds of residents, several hotels, multiple restaurants, a theatre, a saloon, shops, and offices. A raid on one establishment disrupted the businesses around it. Owners could move activities upstairs into rear rooms or across the street. The district had become harder to erase because its economy was embedded inside ordinary buildings. There was no single gate to close. The earthquake also altered the city's social geography by displacing thousands of people from burned areas. Some never returned to their original neighbourhoods. Others moved into newly built central hotels because they needed immediate housing. Immigrants and workers found rooms in the rebuilt district. Men who had previously lived in boarding houses moved into residential hotels. Women living alone used the same buildings, though they were often judged more harshly for doing so. The idea of a respectable home still centred on a private household headed by a married couple. Hotel life challenged that expectation. A person renting one room might eat in restaurants, use public baths, send laundry out, and spend evenings in cafes or theatres. Daily life occurred partly outside the home. The street, lobby, dining room and bar served functions that a private house would have contained. This made the Tenderloin especially attractive to people whose lives did not fit the family model. Performers travelled. Waiters worked late. Salesmen moved from city to city. Divorced or widowed residents might prefer a furnished room. Gay men and lesbians, though not yet able to live openly, could find greater privacy in a district where neighbours changed frequently, and unconventional lives were less unusual. The neighbourhood did not offer complete freedom. Police monitored behaviour. Hotels discriminated. Employers enforced social rules. People risked arrest, violence, or public exposure. It did offer a measure of anonymity unavailable in more closely supervised residential districts. That anonymity had commercial value and social importance. The rebuilt Tenderloin also stood near the new cultural institutions and entertainment businesses that helped San Francisco present itself as recovered. Civic leaders wanted visitors to see theatres, hotels, restaurants, and modern streets rather than endless ruins. By 1915, the city hosted the Panama Pacific International Exposition, an enormous World's Fair celebrating the completion of the Panama Canal and demonstrating San Francisco's return. The fairground stood far from the Tenderloin, but visitors stayed in central hotels, ate in downtown restaurants, and searched for evening entertainment. The city had invited the world to witness its recovery. The Tenderloin helped receive the guests. Some visitors wanted respectable dining and theatre. Others wanted gambling, alcohol, prostitution, or experiences unavailable at home. The district supplied both without requiring a clear boundary between them. The same city that promoted progress at the exposition tolerated old arrangements in its central entertainment zone. That contradiction was not a failure of rebuilding, it was part of the plan. San Francisco needed hotel rooms, it needed nightlife, it needed workers willing to live near late-shift employment, it needed places where visitors could spend money after official attractions closed. The district fulfilled those needs while allowing civic leaders to distance themselves from the consequences. By the middle of the 1910s, the streets north of Market looked substantially different from those that had existed before the earthquake. Taller hotels blocked more sunlight, commercial signs covered the lower floors, electric lighting extended business hours, streetcars delivered customers from other neighbourhoods. The old valley had nearly disappeared beneath construction. Its social character remained recognisable. Police still collected information and favours. Reformers still demanded action. Restaurant owners still used private rooms. Hotel operators still rented to people the wider city preferred not to notice. Workers still kept the district functioning through long hours and low wages. The earthquake had destroyed buildings without destroying demand. It had removed wooden houses but not the need for cheap rooms. It had ended individual businesses but not the political value of nightlife. It had scattered residents but had not changed the district's central location. When people later remembered the disaster, they often described San Francisco as a phoenix rising from the ashes. The image appeared on the city flag long before 1906, and after the catastrophe, it seemed perfectly suited to a place that rebuilt with extraordinary speed. The Tenderloin's return was less ceremonial. It didn't rise through a single civic project. It reappeared in hotel registers, restaurant licenses, rented rooms, theatre programmes, police reports, and the steady movement of people along streets that had been covered in debris only a few years earlier. Its spirit survived because the city reconstructed the same conditions that had created it. Workers needed rooms near downtown. Visitors wanted entertainment. Property owners wanted rent. Politicians needed networks. Police controlled access to profitable illegal activity. People excluded from conventional neighbourhoods needed somewhere to live without providing a respectable explanation. By the time the rebuilt hotels were full and theatre lights reflected from the sidewalks, the district was entering the period that would give it some of its most famous nights. Prohibition would soon make legal drinking illegal, turning ordinary customers into lawbreakers and giving police protection even greater value. Jazz musicians, performers, gamblers, tourists, sailors, and private clubs would crowd streets already prepared for an economy that began when most of the city was going to bed. Jazz musicians, performers, gamblers, tourists, sailors, and private clubs soon crowded streets already prepared for an economy that began when most of San Francisco was going to bed. Before national prohibition arrived, The rebuilt uptown Tenderloin had been filled with legal saloons, restaurants, cabarets, dance halls, theatres, and hotel bars. Alcohol was part of ordinary social life. A businessman could order wine with dinner, a labourer could stop for beer after work, and a traveller could spend the evening moving from a theatre to a restaurant, and then to a saloon without breaking federal law. The 18th Amendment changed the law without changing these habits. National prohibition took effect in January 1920. The manufacture, sale and transportation of intoxicating liquor became illegal under federal law, although possession and private consumption were treated differently. Supporters believed the measure would reduce violence, poverty, family neglect, workplace accidents, and political corruption connected with the liquor trade. In many parts of San Francisco, the new rules were met with open disbelief. The city had developed through shipping, restaurants, hotels, saloons, immigrant communities, and an evening culture in which drinking was accepted. Italian and French families served wine with meals. German traditions included beer gardens and breweries. Working men used saloons as social halls, hiring offices and political meeting places. Hotels depended on dining and entertainment revenue. Tourists expected a city known for pleasure to provide it. A constitutional amendment could prohibit the sale of alcohol. It could not make those customs disappear in a single year. Legal bars removed bottles from their shelves or pretended to do so. Some became soft drink parlours, others served coffee, soda and food in the front, while continuing to sell alcohol in a rear room. Restaurant owners kept liquor beneath counters, inside walls, or in nearby apartments. Hotel employees directed trusted guests to places where drinks could be found. The Tenderloin was particularly suited to this new illegal market. It contained many small businesses, private rooms, service entrances, basements, kitchens, hotel corridors and apartments. Customers arrived at all hours. Strangers did not attract much attention. A delivery could enter through a rear door and disappear into a building containing dozens of tenants. The district also possessed an established culture of selective enforcement. Owners already understood how to negotiate with officers, politicians, inspectors, and intermediaries. Police officers already knew which establishments were protected, which owners were unreliable, and which raids were intended to produce arrests rather than close a business permanently. Prohibition did not invent corruption in the Tenderloin. It increased its value. A legal saloon needed a license. An illegal bar needed silence from everyone who knew it existed. That silence could be purchased. The price depended on the size of the business, the political climate, and the officer or official demanding payment. Some establishments paid regularly. Others relied on friendships or political influence. A bartender might provide free drinks to patrol officers. A proprietor might contribute to a campaign. Someone connected to the police could warn the owner before federal agents arrived. Not every raid was arranged, and not every officer accepted bribes. Federal prohibition agents, local police, and private investigators did make genuine attempts to enforce the law. Yet the number of illegal establishments was too large, and public cooperation was too weak for consistent enforcement. A retired San Francisco officer later recalled that prohibition was so unpopular that it was nearly impossible to enforce. The city's position as a major port also allowed smuggled liquor to enter through the Golden Gate and reach neighborhoods such as the Tenderloin. Liquor came from several directions. Ships carried alcohol along the Pacific coast. Small boats transferred cargo offshore. Trucks brought supplies from Canada and Mexico. Industrial alcohol was stolen, altered, or diverted. Homemade products came from private stills and rural operations. Wine remained available through legal exceptions and illegal distribution networks. Some liquor was genuine and expensive, some was dangerously poor. A customer ordering whiskey in an illegal room could not inspect the supply chain. Bottles were reused, labels were copied. Alcohol intended for industrial use might be filtered or flavoured and sold for drinking. Badly produced spirits caused blindness, poisoning, and death. The risk did not reduce demand. It changed the way customers evaluated a business. A trusted bartender became more valuable. A hotel employee who knew a reliable supplier could earn tips. Restaurants with established reputations could charge higher prices because patrons believed the liquor was safer. The word speakeasy suggests a quiet, hidden room where everyone whispered. Some places fit that description. Others were noisy, crowded businesses known to half the city. Entry might require a password, a membership card, or recognition by the doorman. In less cautious establishments, the only requirement was money. A front room sold legal refreshments while an inner bar operated behind a false wall or partition. A 1922 San Francisco newspaper account described officers breaking through a partition to reveal a passage leading to an illegal inner bar. Federal agents alleged that hundreds of dollars could pass across the counter in only a few hours and accused local officers of accepting protection payments. The architecture of concealment became part of the business. Doors were fitted with buzzers. Lookouts watched the street. Bottles could be lowered through trap doors or moved into neighbouring rooms. Bartenders learned how quickly they could empty a shelf into a sink or concealed cabinet. Owners arranged bail in advance because arrests were treated as an operating expense. A raid could interrupt an evening without ending the establishment. Officers entered, liquor was seized, and employees were taken to a station. The owner paid bail. A lawyer challenged the search or delayed the case. Replacement bottles arrived. The doors opened again. Repeated raids sometimes improved a club's reputation. Customers assumed that a place attracting police attention must offer something worth finding. Newspapers named the establishment, providing free publicity. A proprietor who survived several raids appeared well connected. There were more dangerous consequences as well. The illegal liquor trade attracted organised groups willing to use violence. Smuggling routes, warehouses, deliveries, and territory produced conflict. In 1920, 2 San Francisco police detectives were killed while investigating bootleggers connected to a South of Market warehouse. The killings showed that the dry years could involve more than discreet payments and hidden bottles. The Tenderloin was not dominated by the type of large criminal organisation associated with Chicago, but its nightlife depended on networks of suppliers, drivers, owners, political contacts, and police protection. No successful illegal bar operated entirely alone. Behind the commercial system stood the workers. Someone had to unload the crates, clean the glasses, cook the meals, play the music, check the coats, watch the door, and lead customers through the correct hallway. Many worked late for uncertain wages. Tips often mattered as much as salary. Employees could lose their jobs when a club was raided or closed, even if the owner reopened elsewhere. Women occupied a more visible place in nightlife than they had before the First World War. Young unmarried women and married women increasingly entered cafes, dance halls, and nightclubs without accepting the close supervision expected by earlier generations. They smoked, drank, danced, and selected their own companions. Reformers saw these changes as a threat not only because alcohol was involved, but because women were using public space independently. Dance hall campaigns attempted to control admission, lighting, alcohol, music, and the physical contact permitted between dancers. The same reformers who described women as needing protection often supported rules that restricted women's movement and employment. Popular dances were central to the dispute. Ragtime and early jazz encouraged movements that did not resemble formal ballroom dancing. Partners held each other differently. They moved with greater speed. Some dances included dips, turns, close contact, and improvisation. To people who enjoyed them, these dances were modern and energetic. To opponents, they represented the collapse of discipline. The concern was also racial. Jazz developed from black musical traditions, with roots in blues, ragtime, spirituals, marching music, and the cultural life of African American communities. White audiences consumed the music while critics used racist language to describe its rhythms and dances as primitive or immoral. Black musicians faced discrimination in housing, employment, union membership, and access to major venues. They could provide the music that made a club profitable, while being denied equal treatment as customers or residents. Even so, nightlife created spaces where racial boundaries were crossed more openly than in many daytime settings. Black-owned clubs and dance halls attracted customers from different backgrounds. Musicians exchanged styles and techniques. People who would not have socialized in ordinary public institutions sometimes drank and danced together after midnight. This mixing worried officials as much as the alcohol did. Historical accounts of San Francisco's pre-war jazz scene describe black clubs as centers not only of illegal drinking, but also of behaviour considered socially forbidden, including interracial socialising. The Tenderloin participated in that larger musical world. It did not stand alone. Jazz and nightlife also flourished in the Barbary Coast, North Beach, the Fillmore, and areas south of Market. Musicians travelled between districts during a single night. A player might complete a paid performance in one club, visit another to listen, and end the evening at an informal session lasting until morning. The city's transportation and compact geography made this possible. Streetcars ran through central streets. Taxis waited near hotels. Musicians carried instruments along sidewalks between engagements. Workers finishing late shifts entered cafes that served people whose schedules had no connection to ordinary business hours. The Tenderloin's residential hotels supported the system. Performers could rent rooms near venues. Touring musicians stayed for days or weeks. Waiters and bartenders slept through the morning in buildings only a few steps from their workplaces. Hotel residents formed part of the audience, especially those living alone who used restaurants, bars and lobbies as extensions of their rooms. For a person living in a small furnished room, nightlife was not always a special event. The room might contain only a bed, washstand, chair and wardrobe. There was no kitchen and little space for guests. Social life took place elsewhere. A hotel resident ate in cafes, read newspapers in lobbies, met friends in bars, and listened to music in public rooms. This arrangement helped the neighbourhood remain active across the entire day. When office workers went home, restaurant workers arrived. When theatres emptied, bars filled. When legal businesses closed, private clubs continued. When musicians completed formal performances, informal sessions began. Breakfast counters served the final customers of the night beside the first workers of the morning. A cook preparing eggs at 4 o'clock might serve a musician, a police officer, a hotel clerk, a sex worker, a railroad employee, and a tourist who had lost track of time. Each belonged to a different San Francisco, but they occupied the same counter. Gambling added another layer to the night economy. Cards, dice, dominoes, bookmaking and race betting operated behind ordinary storefronts and inside private clubs. Some games involved small sums among regular customers. Others were organised businesses where owners controlled the room, supplied credit and collected a share. The promise of quick money suited a neighbourhood filled with workers, travellers, and people living from one payment to the next. A customer could win enough to cover a month's rent. More often, the house won. Gambling houses depended on the same protection system as illegal bars. Owners needed warnings, friendly officers, and lawyers prepared for raids. Some became closely associated with particular operators whose names remained known long after the clubs closed. During the final years of Prohibition, and into the following decades, establishments such as the Menlo Club on Eddy Street became associated with organised gambling. Cards, dice, dominoes and race betting remained readily available, despite periodic police operations. The raids followed familiar routines. Photographers sometimes arrived with police, producing images of tables, equipment, arrested employees, and customers hiding their faces. Newspapers presented the action as evidence that authorities were restoring order. The equipment could be replaced. The customers returned. The political protection was rearranged. Burlesque and theatrical entertainment also became more prominent. The rebuilt district stood beside major theatres and contained smaller stages offering vaudeville, comedy, music, dance, and increasingly sexualised performance. Burlesque originally combined satire, sketches, songs, comedians, and suggestive humour. Over time, striptease became a larger part of the attraction. Audiences came from outside the neighbourhood, especially tourists and convention visitors, looking for entertainment that seemed daring without being entirely unfamiliar. The performers worked inside a difficult legal environment. Police and prosecutors debated whether a dance was artistic, suggestive, or obscene. Costumes, movement, and the amount of skin visible on stage could determine whether a show continued or faced a raid. Owners promoted controversy because public outrage sold tickets. A performer criticised by a newspaper might draw a larger crowd the next night. The district became skilled at turning moral condemnation into advertising. Prohibition ended nationally in December 1933, but repeal did not make the Tenderloin quiet. Legal bars reopened. Taverns and beer halls hired musicians. Former speakeasies applied for licenses or changed their names. Employees who had spent years avoiding federal agents began serving drinks openly, although state and local regulations still controlled hours, licenses, and customer behaviour. The end of prohibition removed one source of corruption without removing gambling, prostitution, or the demand for private entertainment. It also arrived during the Great Depression. Unemployment altered the neighbourhood. Hotel residents lost jobs. Musicians competed for fewer engagements. Restaurants closed or reduced staff. Men wandered between hiring offices, relief agencies, cheap cafes, and lodging houses. Nightlife continued because it offered temporary escape and because people still needed work. A musician might accept a lower wage rather than remain unemployed. A bartender relied more heavily on tips. A hotel lowered weekly rates to keep rooms occupied. Gambling attracted people who could least afford to lose. The repeal of prohibition allowed legal beer halls and taverns to reopen, and musicians found piecemeal work in Tenderloin venues, even as talking motion pictures reduced employment in theatres. The city's labour conflicts entered the district as well. The 1934 waterfront strike led to violence, the deaths of 2 workers, and a general strike that shut down much of San Francisco. Restaurants, transportation, and entertainment were disrupted. Musicians and service employees had to decide whether to join the strike, remain home, or attempt to work in a city where ordinary movement had nearly stopped. The nightlife economy depended on labour that was easy for customers to overlook. Every polished bar and theatre contained people concerned about wages, schedules, union rules, safety, and unemployment. The glamour seen from a table did not describe the working conditions behind the curtain. During the late 1930s, tourism and public events brought new crowds. The Golden Gate International Exposition opened on Treasure Island in 1939. Visitors travelled to San Francisco from across the country and abroad. They attended the fair during the day and searched for restaurants, theatres, clubs, and adult entertainment afterward. The Tenderloin was prepared for them. Hotels advertised central locations. Burlesque stages promoted famous performers. Bars filled with travellers. Taxi drivers and hotel clerks recommended establishments according to the customer's interests and willingness to pay. Sally Rand, already famous for her fan dance, appeared in San Francisco and later performed at the Music Box on O'Farrell Street, helping connect burlesque and striptease with the Tenderloin's growing commercial sex economy. Not every night was glamorous. Most consisted of routine work, modest spending, and people seeking company. A hotel resident listened to the radio in a lobby. A waitress finished a 10-hour shift. A musician played for customers who spoke over the entire performance. A bartender wiped the same section of counter repeatedly while waiting for closing time. The neighbourhood's reputation depended on dramatic stories, but its survival depended on repetition. Doors opened every evening, lights were switched on, deliveries arrived, sheets were changed, Floors were cleaned. Money moved from customers to workers, owners, landlords, suppliers, police officers, and political organisations. Then the United States entered the Second World War. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 transformed San Francisco into a major military port. Shipyards expanded. Defence plants hired thousands. Soldiers, sailors, and workers crowded the Bay Area. Hotel rooms became difficult to find. Bars and entertainment businesses served people who expected to leave soon and did not know whether they would return. The Tenderloin became busier and more heavily supervised. Military police patrolled entertainment areas. Certain establishments were declared off-limits for violating liquor rules or attracting behaviour military authorities considered dangerous. Venereal disease became a major concern for the armed forces, leading to increased pressure on sex workers and businesses associated with prostitution. Again, enforcement focused heavily on visible women, while the customers passed through more easily. Wartime crowds strengthened the district's economy while increasing conflict, exploitation, and police attention. After the war, the music changed. San Francisco had long supported traditional jazz, dance bands, and swing. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, bebop and modern jazz gained a stronger audience. New clubs opened in the Tenderloin and North Beach, drawing local players and nationally known musicians. Bebop was not background music designed to help couples move around a dance floor. It demanded attention. The melodies were fast, the harmonies complex, and the improvisation unpredictable. Listeners came to hear musicians rather than simply use the band as part of a larger evening. One of the Tenderloin's most famous jazz clubs was the Black Hawk at Turk and Hyde Streets. The club was dark, narrow, and not especially elegant. Its importance came from the musicians who performed there and the seriousness of its audience. Dave Brubeck, Miles Davis, Thelonious Monk, Jerry Mulligan, and other major figures appeared at the Black Hawk. Live recordings may there preserve performances that later listeners would associate with one of the strongest periods in modern jazz. The club also found an unusual way to admit younger listeners. People below the legal drinking age could sit in a separate area behind wire screening, divided from adult customers, while still able to hear the musicians. One former teenage patron remembered listening from this enclosure to Brubeck, Mulligan, and other performers. It was an arrangement that could only have emerged from the district's mixture of licensing restrictions, improvisation, and commercial need. Young listeners wanted access. The owner wanted their admission money. The law required separation from alcohol. A wire barrier satisfied all three. The Black Hawk belonged to a citywide jazz network rather than an isolated neighbourhood scene. Musicians moved among the Tenderloin, Fillmore, North Beach and waterfront clubs. After formal engagements, they gathered at late-night rooms where playing continued until morning. Some nights, a famous musician sat in without announcement. Word travelled by telephone and personal contact. Waiters, cab drivers, musicians, and regular customers knew where the music would continue after the advertised performance ended. The neighbourhood's nights seemed endless because different businesses kept different hours. A theatre performance ended around 11. A nightclub remained open later. A private gathering continued after legal closing. A cafe served the musicians afterward. Hotel rooms hosted conversations, card games, and drinking until daylight reached the windows. The people on the street changed, but the street never fully emptied. By the 1950s, the Tenderloin's nightlife contained several generations at once. Older bars retained memories of Prohibition. Burlesque theatres attracted tourists. Gambling rooms continued under pressure from police. Modern jazz clubs brought serious listeners into streets outsiders described as dangerous. Gay men, lesbians, transgender people, performers, and gender non-conforming entertainers found limited but meaningful social space in bars and hotels, where conventional rules could be negotiated. These communities were not always welcomed equally, and police harassment remained common. Yet the district's anonymity and commercial tolerance allowed networks to grow. The same quality that had protected illegal drinking now protected other forms of private life. A person could arrive alone, enter a crowded room, and become less visible rather than more visible. That possibility mattered in a period when exposure could cost someone a job, housing, family support, or personal safety. The nights were never free from danger. Customers were robbed, workers were exploited, police raids interrupted businesses, violence occurred inside hotels and on sidewalks, alcohol and drugs damaged lives. Owners profited from people with few alternatives. Still, reducing the neighbourhood to danger would miss what drew people back. They came for music unavailable elsewhere. They came because restaurants served after ordinary kitchens had closed. They came because no one asked why they were alone. They came because a small hotel room felt less isolated after several hours in a crowded bar. They came because the district allowed them to behave differently from the person they were expected to be during the day. For decades, San Francisco depended on this service while treating it as evidence of the Tenderloin's failure. The neighbourhood gave the city a nightlife, housed the people who operated it, absorbed the policing required to regulate it, and accepted the reputational damage produced by everyone who used it. Morning always returned, but it did not reset the district. When the clubs closed, hotel residents remained. Aging workers remained. Musicians who had missed their chance at fame remained. Veterans returned from war and rented rooms. People living on pensions settled into buildings once advertised to travelling salesmen and theatre visitors. The same residential hotels that had supported the nightlife economy began to serve a population with fewer resources and fewer places to go. As suburban growth, changing travel habits, urban redevelopment, and post-war housing policy altered San Francisco, the Tenderloin's old buildings acquired a different role. The lights stayed on, but the city around them was beginning to move in another direction. The lights stayed on, but the city around them was beginning to move in another direction. During the Second World War, San Francisco had been crowded with military personnel, shipyard workers, travellers, and new residents drawn by defence employment. Hotels filled quickly. Restaurants extended their hours. Bars, theatres and clubs benefited from customers who had money to spend, and little certainty about what would happen next. When the war ended, that intense demand did not continue at the same level. Servicemen returned home or were assigned elsewhere. Temporary workers left the Bay Area. Defence production declined. Families who had spent the war years in crowded rooms looked for larger homes. The national economy shifted towards suburban construction, automobile ownership, and household consumption. Across the United States, the ideal home was no longer a furnished room near downtown. It was a detached house with a private kitchen, a bathroom, a yard, and enough space for children. Federal mortgage programs, highway construction, and large suburban developments helped millions of families pursue that ideal. Though racial discrimination prevented many Black, Asian, Latino, and other non-white households from receiving equal access to those opportunities, the Tenderloin had been designed for a different America. Its buildings were created for travelling salesmen, single workers, performers, clerks, widows, retirees, and people who expected to live much of their daily lives outside their rooms. Many hotels offered no private kitchens. Some had shared bathrooms. The rooms were practical when downtown employment, restaurants, streetcars, and public entertainment formed the centre of urban life. Post-war development encouraged people with money to leave that arrangement behind. Families moved westward within San Francisco or crossed into growing suburbs elsewhere in the Bay Area. Businesses followed their customers. Shopping centres provided parking. Motels appeared along highways and near airports, allowing travellers to avoid crowded downtown districts. A visitor arriving by automobile no longer needed a central residential hotel close to a streetcar line. The Tenderloin's buildings remained where they were. A hotel owner could not move a 6-story structure to a suburban highway. The building still required tenants, maintenance, heat, plumbing, elevators, and employees. If middle-class travellers preferred newer accommodations, owners had to lower prices or find different customers. Many residential hotels gradually became permanent low-income housing. This was not necessarily a sudden fall from luxury. Some had always served working-class residents. Others had passed through several stages, beginning as respectable commercial hotels, becoming inexpensive residential properties, and later operating as single-room occupancy hotels. A typical SRO room was small and often shared toilets and showers with other tenants on the same floor. These buildings had long housed migrant workers, sailors, seasonal labourers, immigrants, and people living alone. San Francisco once had so many residential hotels that observers described it as a hotel city, and SROs remained a vital source of housing for people unable to afford conventional apartments. The rooms were modest, but they offered something increasingly rare. They were located near employment and public transportation. They could be rented without the deposit, furniture, and long lease required by an apartment. A tenant did not need to maintain a household large enough to justify a private kitchen. Someone surviving on irregular wages, a pension, or public assistance could sometimes afford a room even when no other central housing was available. As wealthier tenants left, building income declined. Owners postponed repairs, carpets wore out, elevators failed more often. Plumbing systems built decades earlier required constant attention. Decorative lobbies were simplified or closed. Dining rooms disappeared. Furniture was replaced with cheaper pieces or not replaced at all. The building continued to operate because people still needed it. A hotel might look neglected from the street while remaining fully occupied. The lower rents that made maintenance difficult were also the reason residents could stay. This created a problem that would follow the Tenderloin through the second half of the 20th century. If the city allowed the buildings to deteriorate, residents lived with unsafe conditions. If owners renovated them for wealthier tenants, residents could be displaced. If the buildings were demolished, the rooms disappeared entirely. The national enthusiasm for urban renewal made demolition appear attractive to planners. After the war, officials in cities across the United States identified older central neighborhoods as blighted. The word covered many conditions: deteriorated buildings, overcrowding, poverty, mixed land use, small businesses, minority ownership and housing that did not match modern planning ideals. Federal money allowed local redevelopment agencies to acquire property, clear large areas, and transfer land for new construction. Officials promised highways, offices, shopping centres, cultural institutions, modern apartments, and increased tax revenue. San Francisco created its redevelopment agency in 1948. Its most destructive projects were carried out not in the Tenderloin itself, but in nearby districts, especially the Western Addition and the Fillmore. The consequences reached the Tenderloin. The Western Addition contained a major African-American community, Japanese-American residents returning after wartime incarceration, churches, jazz clubs, stores, houses, apartments, and residential hotels. City officials designated portions of it for redevelopment and used eminent domain to acquire property. In the first Western Addition project area alone, the redevelopment plan required the relocation of approximately 1,350 households and 358 businesses. The official plan anticipated reducing the area's population from more than 6,000 to fewer than 4,000. Later phases displaced thousands more. Blocks were cleared before replacement housing and commercial development were ready. Businesses lost the local customers who had supported them. Residents received relocation assistance that often failed to provide access to comparable housing. Racial discrimination limited where displaced black families could move. The redevelopment agency promised renewal, but much of the cleared land remained empty for years. The destruction of the Fillmore became one of San Francisco's most recognized examples of urban renewal damaging an existing community. Archival descriptions of the redevelopment agency record the removal of thousands of housing units, the destruction of businesses, and the displacement of African American and Japanese American residents. Some displaced people moved to other parts of the city. The Tenderloin was one of the places capable of receiving them because it still contained relatively inexpensive rooms. The neighbourhood did not create the displacement, it absorbed part of it. This distinction was rarely reflected in public discussion. When poverty became more visible in the Tenderloin, observers described the neighbourhood as deteriorating. They did not always mention that redevelopment programs had destroyed low-cost housing elsewhere, or that discriminatory housing practices narrowed the choices available to displaced residents. The city removed people from one district and then treated their arrival in another as a local problem. A similar process affected Filipino residents. Beginning in the early 20th century, Filipino migrants had established a community near Kearny and Jackson Streets, an area later known as Manila Town. Many were men who had worked as farm labourers, sailors, cooks, domestic workers, and service employees. Residential hotels provided inexpensive rooms and social networks. Fraternal organisations, restaurants, pool halls, barbershops, and community groups created a support system for residents who often faced racial discrimination and restrictions on employment and marriage. Filipino boarding houses and SAROs also provided temporary lodging to agricultural workers visiting San Francisco between jobs. Redevelopment and commercial expansion gradually destroyed much of Manila Town. Buildings were demolished or converted. Land values increased. Businesses closed. The International Hotel became the final major symbol of the community's struggle to remain. When its owners sought demolition, elderly Filipino tenants and their supporters resisted eviction for years. The campaign brought together residents, students, labour organisers, clergy and housing activists. Although the International Hotel stood outside the Tenderloin, the fight demonstrated what the loss of SRO housing meant. A room was not simply a room. It placed a tenant near friends, food, transportation, employment, and institutions that understood his language and history. Moving someone to a distant building could break those connections even if another bed was technically available. As Manila Town shrank, Filipino residents moved into the Tenderloin and south of Market. The Tenderloin's inexpensive hotels and central location helped the community maintain a presence in San Francisco after its earlier neighbourhood was largely dismantled. Other newcomers arrived for different reasons. Immigrants from Southeast Asia entered the United States in greater numbers after the Vietnam War and the conflicts that followed in Cambodia and Laos. San Francisco received Vietnamese, Cambodian and Laotian refugees, some of whom settled in and around the Tenderloin because apartments and hotel rooms were comparatively affordable. They encountered buildings designed for single adults rather than families. Parents raised children in rooms with limited space. Kitchens were improvised or shared. Bathrooms might be located down the hall. Streets known for bars, adult theatres, drug sales, and prostitution also became routes to school and grocery stores. The Tenderloin's public image remained focused on vice and disorder. Inside the buildings, families were building new lives. Small businesses adapted. Markets began carrying foods requested by immigrant customers. Restaurants opened. Religious organisations provided assistance. Translation and social service needs increased. Children learned English more quickly than their parents and often helped families navigate schools, forms, landlords and government offices. The post-war Tenderloin was becoming more diverse while also becoming poorer. Its older nightlife did not vanish at once. Jazz clubs, bars, gambling rooms, adult theatres, restaurants and performance spaces continued to attract customers. The neighbourhood remained close to Union Square and the theatre district. The balance had changed. Fewer buildings functioned as stylish hotels for middle-class travellers. More depended on long-term tenants with limited incomes. Some businesses closed earlier. Others shifted toward cheaper entertainment or more explicit sexual commerce. Adult theatres and pornography became especially visible during the 1960s and 1970s. Changes in censorship law and public attitudes created new commercial opportunities. Theatre owners found that explicit films could fill aging venues that had lost audiences to television and suburban cinemas. Massage parlours, bookstores, peep shows, and adult businesses appeared on several streets. These establishments strengthened the district's reputation as a sex zone. They also paid rent in buildings that might otherwise have remained vacant. The same pattern that had shaped the old Vice economy returned. San Francisco condemned the businesses while collecting taxes, licensing fees, rent, and tourist spending connected with them. Police enforcement remained inconsistent. Raids occurred. Owners challenged obscenity laws. Businesses reopened. Political campaigns promised to remove pornography from public view. The district adapted to each new legal boundary. Meanwhile, the social population inside the hotels continued to change. Older workers aged in place. A man who had moved into a room while employed in a restaurant might still live there after retirement. A performer who had expected a temporary stay remained after engagements became less frequent. Veterans rented rooms after returning from Korea or Vietnam. People living on disability payments or small pensions found that the Tenderloin was one of the few places where they could survive without a car. Mental health policy added another pressure. For much of the early 20th century, California housed large numbers of people with mental illnesses in state institutions. Conditions inside those hospitals varied and were often poor. Patients could be confined for years with limited legal protection, inadequate treatment, and little control over their own lives. By the 1950s and 1960s, reformers, civil liberties advocates, psychiatrists, families, and public officials increasingly supported moving patients out of large institutions. New psychiatric medications made community treatment seem more practical. Court decisions and legislation strengthened the rights of people facing involuntary commitment. California adopted the Lanterman-Petrus Short Act in 1967. Its stated purposes included ending inappropriate and indefinite involuntary commitment and providing prompt evaluation and treatment. The legal reform addressed genuine abuses. The support system intended to replace state hospitalization did not develop adequately. Community mental health programs expanded, but funding and capacity lagged behind need. A review by California's legislative analyst later noted that counties complained throughout the 1970s and 1980s that state support for community mental health services was insufficient. Deinstitutionalization therefore produced mixed results. Many people gained freedom from institutions where they did not belong. Others were discharged without stable housing, regular treatment, supportive families, or sufficient income. Some moved through short hospital stays, temporary rooms, jails, emergency departments, and the streets. The Tenderloin contained the housing and services most likely to receive them. Its SROs accepted tenants who could not meet the requirements of ordinary apartments. Clinics, churches, meal programs, and social service agencies operated nearby. Public transportation connected residents to hospitals and government offices. Again, the neighborhood absorbed the consequences of decisions made elsewhere. When a person experiencing severe mental illness appeared on a Tenderloin sidewalk, the public saw a local disturbance. The chain of events behind that moment might include state hospital closures, inadequate community care, poverty, lost employment, family breakdown, and a housing market with almost no room for error. The neighborhood became the final visible location in a much longer institutional failure. Substance use followed a related pattern. Alcohol had always been present in the Tenderloin. Heroin, amphetamines, barbiturates, and other drugs circulated through parts of the district during the post-war years. Different substances became more visible at different times. Drug use affected residents, visitors, sex workers, veterans, musicians, and people trying to manage pain or trauma. Dealers took advantage of dense streets, hotel rooms, and a population that included many vulnerable customers. Law enforcement responded with arrests and street operations. Those actions removed individual dealers or users without changing the conditions that maintained demand. Imprisonment could make employment and housing more difficult afterward. Police pressure moved activity between blocks or into buildings. By the 1970s, several forces were converging. Urban renewal had destroyed low-cost housing in nearby neighbourhoods. Residential hotels were deteriorating. Community mental health services remained underfunded. Vietnam veterans returned with physical injuries, trauma, addiction, and difficulty finding stable work. Manufacturing and waterfront employment declined. Inflation and unemployment weakened low-income households. The Tenderloin had not caused any of these developments. It became the place where they met. Newspaper accounts increasingly described robbery, drug dealing, untreated mental illness, and fear on the streets. A later review of the neighbourhood's decline identified the late 1960s and 1970s as a major turning point, linking redevelopment displacement, the closing of state mental hospitals, and the arrival of struggling Vietnam veterans to worsening conditions. The language used at the time often removed those causes. People were described as derelicts, addicts, criminals, transients, or mentally disturbed individuals. Such labels reduced a person's history to the behaviour visible at that moment. A veteran sleeping in a hotel hallway became a nuisance. An elderly tenant confused on the street became a police problem. A person using heroin in an alley became evidence of moral decline. The institutions that had failed them remained outside the photograph. Housing loss intensified the damage. Across American cities, hundreds of thousands of SRO rooms disappeared during the second half of the 20th century. Hotels were demolished, converted to tourist use, or combined into more expensive apartments. In San Francisco, thousands of low-rent units were lost through demolition and conversion between 1970 and 2000. Every lost room reduced the margin separating poverty from homelessness. A person could survive on a modest check while paying weekly rent in an SRO. Remove the room, and the same income might not cover any legal housing in the city. The Tenderloin retained more of these buildings than many other central neighbourhoods. That survival was partly accidental, and partly the result of organised resistance. The area had not yet become attractive enough for large-scale luxury redevelopment. Its reputation discouraged some investors. Dense ownership patterns made assembling large development sites difficult. Hundreds of tenants already occupied the hotels. The conditions that made the neighbourhood appear undesirable to outsiders helped protect its housing from immediate demolition. Residents understood that this protection could disappear. By the 1970s, the convention and tourism industries wanted additional upscale hotels near Union Square and Market Street. Developers proposed large towers along the lower edge of the Tenderloin. Each project threatened to increase land values and encourage the conversion or demolition of nearby residential hotels. Tenant organisers began building alliances. They worked with senior citizens, housing lawyers, religious groups, neighbourhood businesses, gay and transgender activists, and non-profit organisations. They attended planning commission hearings and board of supervisors meetings. They demanded limits on hotel conversions and protections for low-income residents. The language of their campaign was practical. People needed rooms. A luxury hotel might create jobs and tax revenue, but it could not replace housing affordable to someone living on a pension. A new tower could contain hundreds of visitor rooms while removing the small residential units that kept hundreds of permanent residents off the streets. Activists formed the North of Market Planning Coalition and other organisations to oppose what they called the Manhattanization of the Tenderloin. Their pressure helped produce agreements requiring developers to provide money and protections benefiting the existing community. The Tenderloin Neighbourhood Development Corporation later emerged from efforts to respond to proposed luxury hotels and preserve affordable housing. The fight was not simply against change. Residents wanted repairs, safer streets, parks, grocery stores, healthcare, and investment. They opposed a form of improvement that removed the people most in need of those things. That distinction became more urgent when visible homelessness grew during the early 1980s. San Francisco had always contained people without stable housing. But the modern crisis expanded under the combined pressure of federal and state cuts, inadequate mental health care, reduced public housing support, unemployment, high rents, and the needs of veterans. The Tenderloin and nearby downtown districts were affected most heavily. People slept in doorways, parks, abandoned buildings, vehicles and temporary shelters. The city initially treated the situation as an emergency that might pass. Churches opened winter shelters and meal programs. Officials paid for short stays in inexpensive hotels. Old buses were used as temporary sleeping spaces. These measures kept some people alive without producing enough permanent housing. The shelters closed during the day. Hotel placements ended. A person moved from a bed to the sidewalk and then joined another line that evening. The Tenderloin sidewalks became waiting rooms for systems that rarely had enough capacity. Residents who were already struggling felt the consequences directly. An elderly tenant had to pass drug sellers near the entrance to buy groceries. A refugee family raised children beside buildings used as temporary shelters. A hotel worker dealt with overdoses, psychiatric crises, and broken plumbing without adequate training or support. Small business owners cleaned doorways and called city departments that sent them from one office to another. Some residents demanded more police. Others feared the police because previous operations had targeted poor people, sex workers, queer residents, and communities of colour. Many wanted both safety and protection from abusive enforcement. Officials repeatedly presented these goals as though only one could be chosen. The neighbourhood's growing network of non-profit organisations attempted to fill the gaps. Churches served meals. Legal groups defended tenants. Health clinics treated people who lacked regular care. Housing organisations purchased deteriorating hotels and repaired them. Outreach workers helped residents apply for benefits and remain housed. The Tenderloin Neighbourhood Development Corporation began in 1981 with the renovation of a single run-down SRO hotel and later became a major community-based housing organisation. It eventually combined affordable housing with tenant services intended to help residents maintain stability. These organisations did important work. Their presence also reinforced the city's habit of concentrating poverty services in the Tenderloin. A person released from a hospital, jail, treatment programme or shelter was often directed toward the same small area because that was where the available room, meal, clinic or caseworker could be found. The neighbourhood became a service centre because need was already concentrated there. Need became further concentrated because the services were there. By the late 20th century, the Tenderloin contained several different communities sharing the same blocks. There were elderly residents who remembered the district's jazz clubs. There were Filipino tenants displaced from Manila town. There were Southeast Asian refugee families. There were gay and transgender residents who had found social space in the neighbourhood. There were veterans, hotel workers, immigrants, people with severe illnesses, children, small business owners, artists, sex workers, and people moving between shelters and the street. Public officials often discussed them as a single problem population. They were not a single population. They did not have the same needs or the same reasons for living there. Some required medical treatment, some needed employment, some wanted police protection, some needed protection from police, some were one missed payment away from homelessness, others had lived in the same room for decades. What connected them was the limited number of places where they could afford to exist. America had changed around the Tenderloin. It had built suburbs, highways, office towers, convention centres, shopping malls and luxury hotels. It had replaced streetcars with automobiles, factories with service work, public hospitals with community treatment, and old neighbourhoods with redevelopment projects. The Tenderloin stayed because its buildings still performed a function the new city did not want to admit it needed. They provided small rooms for people who could not afford larger ones. They kept residents near services and public transportation. They accepted tenants with irregular histories and limited income. They housed the workers, newcomers, elderly people, and vulnerable residents excluded from the post-war ideal. The neighbourhood paid a high price for performing that function. Concentrated poverty weakened businesses and buildings. Inadequate treatment became public disorder. Drug markets exploited residents. Political leaders used the streets as campaign scenery. Tourists passed through and assumed what they saw represented the entire community. The city called the Tenderloin resistant to improvement. Residents saw a different pattern. Each time another neighbourhood removed low-cost housing, more people arrived. Each time another institution discharged patients without support, the hotels received them. Each time officials cut services and increased enforcement, the streets became more unstable. The Tenderloin had not refused to change. It had been forced to remain the place that absorbed the changes everyone else celebrated, and the people living there were beginning to organise not only to preserve their rooms, but to defend their right to define the neighbourhood for themselves. The Tenderloin had been forced to absorb the changes that other parts of San Francisco celebrated, and by the 1960s and 1970s, the people living there were beginning to understand that survival required more than endurance. They had to organise. For decades, outsiders had spoken about the neighbourhood as though its residents were temporary. Hotel tenants were called transients, even when they had occupied the same room for 20 years. Elderly men living on pensions were described as drifters. Immigrant families were treated as recent arrivals, regardless of how long they intended to remain. Sex workers, queer youth, disabled residents, and people living with mental illness were discussed as populations to manage rather than neighbours with claims on the city. This language made displacement easier. A city hesitates before removing a stable community. It feels less responsibility toward people it has defined as passing through. Tenderloin residents challenged that definition by insisting that a rented room was a home, a hotel hallway was part of a residential building, and a person without property could still belong to a neighbourhood. The struggle occurred inside buildings before it appeared at public hearings. Tenants dealt with failed heating systems, broken elevators, leaking pipes, insects, poor ventilation, and bathrooms that landlords did not clean or repair. Some owners attempted to remove long-term residents so rooms could be rented to tourists at higher daily rates. Others used illegal lockouts, suddenly changing a door lock and leaving a tenant's belongings inside. A person living in a conventional apartment might have a written lease, several rooms, and enough money to hire an attorney. Many SRO tenants had none of those advantages. Their housing arrangements could be informal. Receipts were lost. Managers changed. Tenants did not always understand local regulations or speak English comfortably. Some fear that complaining would lead to eviction. Others had previous experiences with courts, police, hospitals, or government offices that taught them not to expect fair treatment. A landlord did not need to win a formal case if a tenant could be frightened into leaving. The people who resisted learned that individual complaints were rarely enough. A manager could ignore one resident. It was more difficult to ignore an entire floor. Tenants began meeting in rooms, lobbies, churches, and community offices. They compared experiences and discovered that what had seemed like a private problem was often a building-wide practice. Several residents had lost heat at the same time. Several had been threatened by the same manager. Several had been told that visitors were forbidden, even when the rule was being used to isolate elderly or disabled tenants. The meetings changed the relationship between residents. A neighbour previously known only as the man in room 312 became someone who had saved rent receipts for 5 years. A woman living near the elevator knew how to contact the Department of Building Inspection. A younger tenant could translate a notice. Someone else had a telephone and was willing to call a lawyer. Organisation turned small resources into collective power. The Tenderloin Housing Clinic opened in 1980, initially staffed by student volunteers, to help tenants understand and enforce their legal rights. Its early work focused on preventing displacement and addressing unsafe conditions in apartments and residential hotels. The organisation later described campaigns against landlords who failed to provide heat and hot water, efforts to prevent the conversion of residential hotels to tourist use, legal challenges to restrictive visitor policies, and actions against illegal lockouts. These disputes concerned more than comfort. In a cold hotel room, inadequate heat could become dangerous for an elderly tenant. A broken elevator could trap a disabled resident on an upper floor. A rule prohibiting visitors could prevent family members, nurses, friends or social workers from providing assistance. Hotel owners sometimes defended no-visitor rules as necessary for security. Tenants understood that the rules also gave management greater control over private life. A resident paying rent for a room was treated as though he occupied a bed in an institution. The manager decided who could enter, how long a guest could remain, and whether a tenant was entitled to the ordinary privacy of a home. Winning visitor rights meant establishing that an SRO tenant was not merely a customer. The room was a residence. The same principle shaped campaigns against hotel conversion. Tourist rooms produced higher revenue than low-rent residential rooms. As San Francisco's visitor economy expanded, owners had an incentive to remove permanent tenants and market buildings to travellers. A room rented for a modest monthly amount could be far more profitable if rented nightly. Each conversion looked small when considered separately. One hotel removed 20 rooms from the residential market. Another removed 40. A third claimed that its residents were temporary guests and therefore did not qualify for tenant protections. Across the city, the losses accumulated. Housing activists pushed for stronger rules limiting the conversion and demolition of residential hotels. These policies did not make the rooms luxurious. They preserved their basic function as housing for people who had few alternatives. The fight revealed two competing ideas of downtown. Developers and tourism officials imagined a central district filled with visitors, convention business, upscale hotels, theatres, restaurants and offices. Residents imagined a mixed neighbourhood where poor people, elderly tenants, immigrants and workers were still allowed to live near the centre of the city. Both groups spoke about improvement. They disagreed about who was expected to remain after the improvement occurred. The conflict became especially visible when developers proposed luxury hotels along the Tenderloin's edges. Large projects promised construction jobs, permanent employment, tax revenue, and new investment. Supporters argued that the neighbourhood needed economic growth. Residents worried that luxury development would raise nearby property values, encourage further conversions, and push existing tenants from the hotels that remained. They had seen what urban renewal had done in the Fillmore and Manila town. They knew that promises of replacement housing often arrived after demolition, if they arrived at all. Community activists responded by forming coalitions capable of negotiating with city officials and developers. The Tenderloin Neighbourhood Development Corporation emerged in 1981 amid opposition to proposed luxury hotel development and fears of gentrification. Its early strategy combined acquiring buildings, organising tenants, and mobilising residents to protect the neighbourhood. TNDC purchased its first deteriorated SRO, the Arty Hotel, and converted its 40 rooms into permanently affordable housing. By the end of the decade, it had acquired 8 buildings containing roughly 500 homes. This approach altered the usual pattern. A private owner might preserve low rents only until the property became valuable enough to sell or convert. A non-profit owner could remove the building from the speculative market and commit it to long-term affordability. Acquisition did not solve every problem. Old buildings still required repairs. Residents still needed services. Funding was complicated and limited. It did make displacement less dependent on the next owner's calculations. The effort was supported by people who believed that community control required ownership as well as protest. Among them was Franciscan friar Kelly Cullen, one of the neighbourhood figures associated with organising residents and building institutions capable of holding property for public benefit. Cullen lived and worked in the Tenderloin. He moved through its streets at hours when many officials experienced the neighbourhood only through police briefings or supervised tours. His work reflected an idea that would guide much of the district's organising. Residents were not problems waiting for professionals to solve them. They were participants whose knowledge had to shape the response. The neighbourhood also contained another institution that approached belonging in a different way. Glyde Memorial Church had been established long before the post-war crisis, but during the 1960s it underwent a transformation. Under Reverend Cecil Williams and a group of ministers, organisers, artists and community workers, Glyde became closely involved with people excluded by conventional churches and civic institutions. Williams arrived in 1963. He did not approach the Tenderloin as a missionary entering a foreign place. He argued that the church had to become accountable to the people around it. Traditional religious services were replaced by energetic celebrations involving music, political speeches, testimony, and direct participation. Glyde opened its doors to poor residents, people with addictions, sex workers, gay men, lesbians, transgender people, young runaways, activists, and people who had been rejected elsewhere. The welcome was not presented as a reward for first becoming respectable. People were invited to enter as they were. During the 1960s, Glyde became connected with the Council on Religion and the Homosexual. Early queer organising, programmes for runaway youth, campaigns against police abuse, recovery efforts, racial justice activism, and groups representing people who rarely received support from established churches. Its history includes work with Vanguard, Citizen Alert, the Black Man's Free Store, the National Sex Forum, and programmes addressing addiction and recovery. Food became one of Glyde's most visible services. A meal programme provided immediate help to someone who could not wait for a long-term policy solution. During the homelessness, crack cocaine, and AIDS crises of the 1980s, Glyde expanded its daily meals and other programmes, eventually serving food several times each day while maintaining its role as a centre of political and spiritual life. The meals mattered because hunger limited every other kind of participation. A person unable to find food was less able to attend a tenant meeting, keep a medical appointment, search for work, or challenge an eviction. Meeting immediate needs did not replace political organising. It allowed people to remain alive and present long enough to organise. Glyde also offered a location where people from different Tenderloin populations encountered one another. An elderly hotel resident stood in line near a homeless teenager. A church volunteer worked beside someone recovering from addiction. Politicians entered a room filled with people rarely invited into City Hall. The contact did not erase conflict. Residents disagreed about policing, drug use, prostitution, development, religion, and the allocation of limited resources. Some worried that meal programs and shelters attracted additional hardship to the neighbourhood. Others argued that refusing services would not make poverty disappear. The important change was that Tenderloin residents were increasingly speaking publicly for themselves. That tradition had already appeared dramatically in the district's queer and transgender history. During the 1950s and 1960s, transgender women, drag queens, gay hustlers, and gender non-conforming young people gathered in Tenderloin hotels, bars, streets, and all-night cafeterias. Many were excluded from conventional employment and housing. Some survived through sex work. Others worked in entertainment, restaurants, beauty services, or informal jobs. Police harassment was routine. Officers used laws against loitering, vagrancy, prostitution, and clothing considered inconsistent with a person's assigned sex. An individual did not need to commit a serious offence to be stopped, questioned, searched, or arrested. The purpose was partly enforcement and partly intimidation. Repeated arrest created fines and records that made legal employment more difficult. Police contact could expose someone to family members or employers. Officers could demand information, threaten violence, or use a person's gender expression as justification for humiliation. Businesses sometimes welcomed queer and transgender customers because they spent money, then removed them when police complained. Compton's cafeteria at Turk and Taylor Streets became a gathering place because it remained open late and offered inexpensive food. Young transgender women and other queer patrons could sit indoors, speak with friends, and remain visible to one another. It was not completely safe. Management sometimes called police to remove customers considered undesirable. Officers made arrests. Tension grew between patrons who needed the space and employees or owners who wanted to control it. In the summer of 1966, a police attempt to arrest a transgender woman triggered resistance. According to accounts preserved through later historical research and community memory, she threw hot coffee at an officer. Fighting spread inside and outside the cafeteria. Dishes and furniture were thrown, windows were broken, police vehicles were damaged. Transgender women, drag queens, hustlers and allies fought officers in the street. The Compton's cafeteria uprising occurred 3 years before the Stonewall Rebellion in New York, and is remembered as one of the earliest recorded acts of collective militant resistance by transgender and queer people against police harassment in the United States. The event was not widely reported at the time. No famous national organization immediately turned it into a founding story. Many participants were poor, transgender, involved in street economies, or without access to institutions that preserved archives. For years, the uprising was nearly forgotten outside the people who remembered being there. Its recovery changed the historical understanding of the Tenderloin. The neighbourhood was not only a place where queer and transgender people were victimised, it was a place where they fought back. Resistance did not begin when respectable organisations invited them to join a movement. It began when people who had been pushed from parks, jobs, housing and public businesses refused another arrest in one of the few places where they could gather. Compton's did not end police harassment. It contributed to a growing network of organising. Vanguard, formed by young gay and transgender people in the Tenderloin, challenged police treatment, discrimination and the conditions facing queer youth. Glide provided meeting space and institutional support. Organisers pushed for social services that did not require people to hide their identities. Later generations of activists would connect these efforts to the wider history of gay liberation and transgender rights. For people living through the period, the needs were immediate. They wanted to enter a cafeteria without being arrested. They wanted a room that a landlord could not take away without warning. They wanted work that did not depend on hiding. They wanted police to stop using identity as evidence of criminality. The neighbourhood's Asian immigrant communities developed their own forms of organisation. Filipino residents displaced by the decline of Manila towns settled in Tenderloin hotels and apartments. Community workers helped elderly tenants obtain benefits, medical care and protection from eviction. Restaurants, stores, senior programs and cultural associations allowed residents to maintain relationships weakened by earlier displacement. Southeast Asian refugee families faced different circumstances. Many had arrived after war, political persecution, forced migration, and years in refugee camps. They entered a city with high housing costs and limited space. Tenderloin apartments and sorrow rooms provided access to schools, buses, social agencies, and other families from similar backgrounds. Parents encountered unfamiliar laws and institutions. Children often learned English more rapidly and served as interpreters. Community groups helped families navigate housing problems, welfare offices, medical systems, and schools. Their presence challenged the image of the Tenderloin as a neighbourhood of single adult men. Children played in crowded apartments and hotel corridors. Families shopped along streets associated in the public imagination with bars and adult theatres. Parents tried to create ordinary routines in buildings never designed for large households. They needed playgrounds, safe crossings, schools, groceries, and places to gather. For many years, the Tenderloin had fewer parks and recreational spaces than other San Francisco neighborhoods. Land was expensive, blocks were dense, and public decisions had historically prioritized downtown commerce over residential needs. Parents and youth advocates pressed for programs and safer public areas. TNDC established an after-school program in 1993 in response to the neighborhood's limited outdoor space and shortage of youth services. The program gave children a supervised place for study, recreation, and support outside school hours. The program represented another claim about who belonged. A neighborhood containing children could not be treated solely as an entertainment district, police zone, or service corridor. Families had a right to shape its streets. Latino immigrants also became a larger part of the Tenderloin community. Language barriers made tenant disputes especially difficult. A resident might receive a legal notice without understanding its meaning or deadline. An owner could exploit uncertainty about immigration status, knowing tenants might avoid public agencies. Tenant organisers responded with culturally and linguistically specific assistance. La Voz Latina developed from tenant rights organising in the Tenderloin and became a resource and leadership program for Latino immigrant families. Created in 2005, it offered Spanish-language support and helped residents advocate for themselves in housing and neighbourhood matters. The phrase, advocate for themselves, was significant. Community organisations could represent tenants in court or negotiate with landlords, but lasting power depended on residents learning how the system worked and speaking collectively. A tenant who understood a notice could help the next person who received one. A parent who attended a city hearing could explain the process to another family. A resident who once remained silent during an inspection could become a building organiser. The Central City SRO Collaborative expanded this kind of work among residential hotel tenants in the Tenderloin and south of Market. Organisers distributed information, documented building conditions, and worked to improve health and safety enforcement. These campaigns required patience. A broken heater could be photographed in a minute. Forcing a repair might require repeated calls, inspections, notices, hearings, and legal action. Owners knew that exhausted tenants might give up. Organisers attempted to make persistence possible by sharing the burden. Residents also organised around street conditions. The crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s brought severe harm to the neighbourhood. Drug sales became more visible. Addiction affected tenants and families. Violence increased around some markets. Residents felt trapped between dealers and enforcement strategies that sometimes treated everyone on the block as suspicious. Marches and neighbourhood patrols demanded safer streets. The Tenderloin Housing Clinic's Historical Archive records a 1985 march led by neighbourhood advocates calling for greater safety. Such campaigns were complicated. Some residents wanted more arrests and a larger police presence. Others had experienced abuse from officers and feared that intensified enforcement would target poor people, black residents, immigrants, sex workers, and queer youth rather than the most powerful people controlling illegal markets. Many wanted the city to make a distinction it often refused to make. They wanted protection without harassment. They wanted dealers stopped without hotel tenants being searched merely for standing outside. They wanted violent behaviour addressed without poverty itself being treated as a crime. The AIDS epidemic made these tensions even more urgent. During the 1980s, gay men, transgender people, people who injected drugs, sex workers, and others in and around the Tenderloin faced illness, stigma, and death. Government response was slow. Families sometimes rejected sick relatives. Employers discriminated. Housing became unstable as people lost work or required care. Community networks provided food, transportation, emotional support, medical advocacy, and companionship. Glide expanded its work during the AIDS crisis, combining direct service with public support for people whom other institutions still condemned. The epidemic exposed the value of the very social networks reformers had often tried to break apart. Friends visited hotel rooms, volunteers delivered meals, neighbours checked whether someone had taken medication, people attended funerals and then returned to care for the next person. The Tenderloin's reputation for anonymity existed beside a strong culture of mutual recognition. A desk clerk knew which tenant had not come downstairs. A restaurant worker noticed when a regular customer stopped appearing. A church volunteer remembered a name. These relationships rarely appeared in official statistics, but they helped people survive. Not everyone survived, and not every organisation lived up to its ideals. Non-profits could become bureaucratic. Housing providers sometimes failed tenants. Community leaders disagreed. Programs competed for funding. Residents could feel that professionals were making careers from neighbourhood suffering. The growth of a service system did not eliminate poverty or homelessness. It did produce buildings legal protections, meals, clinics, and organised constituencies that made wholesale displacement more difficult. By the 1990s, San Francisco was entering another economic transformation. Technology companies, finance, tourism, and real estate investment brought new wealth. Office development expanded south of Market. Rents rose. Neighbourhoods once dismissed as undesirable attracted buyers and developers. The Tenderloin's location became more valuable. It stood beside Union Square, Civic Centre, major transit lines, theatres, and downtown employment. The same proximity that had made it useful for low-income residents made it tempting to investors. Some property owners saw the possibility of converting old rooms into boutique hotels or renovated apartments. Businesses designed for wealthier customers appeared near the district's edges. City leaders again described development as an opportunity to improve the neighbourhood. Residents had heard the promise before. They knew that improvement could mean repaired elevators and cleaner sidewalks. It could also mean that they would no longer be able to afford the building after it was repaired. The institutions created during earlier struggles gave them tools to respond. Housing non-profits purchased properties. Tenant lawyers challenged unlawful evictions. Organisers tracked hotel conversions. Churches and advocacy groups brought residents to public meetings. Community coalitions negotiated with developers. The people who refused to leave were not refusing every change. They wanted heat, safety, employment, healthcare, schools, parks, and functioning buildings. They refused the idea that the price of obtaining those things had to be their removal. An elderly Filipino tenant who had already lost Manila Town did not see relocation as a fresh start. A transgender resident who had found acceptance near Turk and Taylor did not assume another district would offer the same protection. A refugee family whose children attended local schools could not be treated as easily movable simply because the apartment was small. A disabled SRO tenant living near a clinic and bus line could lose independence if sent to a distant neighbourhood. Place mattered, because relationships mattered. A room's value could not be measured only by square feet. It included the person downstairs who held a spare key, the grocery store that extended credit, the pharmacist who knew a resident's medication, the church serving breakfast, and the neighbour who noticed when something was wrong. Leaving meant losing that network. The city had often mistaken poverty for rootlessness. Tenderloin residents demonstrated that people with the fewest possessions could have the strongest dependence on place. They stayed because the neighbourhood contained housing they could afford. They stayed because they had nowhere else to go. They also stayed because they had built lives there. By the end of the 20th century, the Tenderloin was no longer merely the district that absorbed unwanted people and unwanted activities. It had become one of San Francisco's most organised low-income communities. Its political strength did not come from wealth. It came from density, memory, and the experience of repeated threats. Residents had watched surrounding neighbourhoods change. They had seen hotels disappear, communities scattered, and promises forgotten. Each struggle taught them how development worked, how public hearings were conducted, how laws could preserve rooms, and how officials responded when hundreds of people arrived together. Their victories were incomplete. Unsafe buildings remained, drug markets remained, homelessness remained, police conflict remained, yet thousands of affordable rooms survived in a part of the city where the land beneath them became extraordinarily valuable. That survival was not an accident. It was the result of tenants who saved notices, residents who knocked on doors, ministers who opened buildings, lawyers who challenged lockouts, organisers who attended long meetings, and neighbours who refused to accept the city's description of them as temporary. They had established a principle that would shape every future battle over the Tenderloin. The neighbourhood could not be controlled simply by controlling its streets. Anyone seeking to transform it would have to confront the people inside its buildings, the organisations they had created, and a history that had taught them exactly what happened when they were promised that displacement was necessary for progress. Anyone seeking to transform the Tenderloin would have to confront the people inside its buildings, the organisations they'd created, and a history that had taught them exactly what happened when displacement was presented as progress. That history explains why no government, police department, developer, reform campaign, or criminal organisation has ever truly controlled the neighbourhood. Many have controlled parts of it. Police have controlled particular corners for an evening. Landlords have controlled rooms and hallways. Political organisations have controlled licences and appointments. Dealers have controlled sections of sidewalk. Developers have controlled individual properties. Non-profit groups have preserved buildings. Churches have created spaces where different rules applied. City officials have changed traffic, zoning, policing and social service policy. No one has controlled all of it for long. The Tenderloin is too dense, too divided, too useful, and too connected to the rest of San Francisco to be governed by a single interest. Its streets appear small on a map. A person can walk across much of the neighbourhood in less than half an hour. Yet each block contains layers of authority that overlap without completely replacing one another. The city controls the pavement. A private owner controls the building beside it. A hotel manager controls the lobby. A tenant controls a rented room, though often imperfectly. A business owner controls a storefront during operating hours. A church or non-profit controls a service centre. A police officer may control a doorway for several minutes. A group of residents can control the meaning of a public hearing by arriving in sufficient numbers. These forms of control exist at the same time. That is why an order announced at City Hall rarely produces the exact result officials expect on the street. A mayor can promise to remove drug dealing, but dealers change locations, methods and hours. Police can clear a corner, but they cannot eliminate the demand that created the market. A developer can renovate a building, but tenant protections may limit who can be removed. A landlord can neglect a property, but organisers may bring inspectors, lawyers and reporters into the dispute. Even criminal power remains unstable. Dealers compete, suppliers change, arrests disrupt networks, customers move, violence attracts enforcement. No group can permanently own a neighbourhood where thousands of residents, workers, visitors, officers, and service providers move through the same compact space every day. The Tenderloin's lack of a single centre makes it difficult to command. There is no main square where control of one building determines control of the district. There is no gate. There is no wall separating residents from downtown workers, hotel guests, theatre audiences, commuters, and people arriving for government services. Market Street runs along one edge. Civic Centre lies nearby. Union Square and major hotels stand only a few blocks away. Transit lines carry people into and through the district. Courts, government offices, theatres, hospitals and tourist areas remain close. The Tenderloin is not isolated enough to be abandoned completely. It is not wealthy enough to receive the same protection as San Francisco's most expensive neighbourhoods. It exists between those conditions. The city cannot forget it because it is in the centre. The city does not fully repair it because the people most affected possess less political and economic power than those in surrounding districts. This creates a repeating pattern. Conditions become severe enough to attract public attention. Officials announce an initiative. Police presence increases. Sidewalks are cleared. Arrests rise. Services are added or reorganised. Reporters visit. Political leaders walk through the neighbourhood with staff and security. For a time, visible conditions may change. Then officers are reassigned. Funding ends. Courts dismiss cases or release defendants. Dealers adjust. Shelters remain full. Treatment beds remain limited. Housing costs remain high. People discharged from hospitals, jails, or temporary programs return to the same streets. The initiative is declared ineffective. Another one begins later with a new name. The neighbourhood has experienced versions of this cycle since the first reformers entered its saloons and private restaurants. The objects of concern have changed from gambling tables and illegal liquor to heroin, crack cocaine, methamphetamine, fentanyl, homelessness, and public mental health crises. The political performance remains familiar. A problem produced by conditions across the city and country becomes concentrated in the Tenderloin. Officials treat the neighbourhood as though it produced the problem on its own. Enforcement is then directed toward the place where the consequences are easiest to see. This does not mean enforcement has no effect. Residents need protection from assault, theft, exploitation, and dangerous drug markets. A person selling a lethal substance outside a residential hotel causes real harm. A violent individual should not be excused because larger institutions have failed. A family should not have to accept unsafe sidewalks as the price of affordable housing. Tenderloin residents have repeatedly demanded stronger action against serious crime. They have also demanded that the city stop confusing crime with poverty. That distinction is difficult for government agencies to maintain because visible poverty makes enforcement appear productive. An officer can order a person to move, a sanitation crew can remove a tent, a patrol can prevent people from gathering in a doorway. It is harder to create enough housing, psychiatric care, addiction treatment, employment, and long-term support to prevent the same conditions from returning. Moving a person takes minutes. Stabilising a life can take years. Public policy often favours the action that can be photographed by the end of the day. The Tenderloin reveals the weakness of that approach because displaced people do not disappear. They move around the block into another doorway, through an emergency room, into jail, into a temporary hotel placement, and eventually back into public view. The district has therefore become a measure of what San Francisco is willing to solve rather than merely relocate. Housing remains the most important part of the answer. The residential hotels built after the 1906 fire were never intended to become the final shelter of a modern metropolitan region. They were commercial buildings for workers, visitors, and people living outside the conventional family household. Yet more than a century later, many continue to provide rooms for low-income tenants, seniors, disabled people, immigrants, and formerly homeless residents. San Francisco planning documents have recognized SROs as an important part of the city's affordable housing stock and have restricted their conversion into tourist hotels. The city has estimated that its SRO inventory includes tens of thousands of rooms, concentrated in the Tenderloin, Chinatown, south of Market, and the Mission. Those rooms limit what developers can do. A vacant building can be transformed with relatively little human conflict. An occupied SRO contains tenants with rights, histories, advocates, and nowhere else to go. Removing them requires legal proceedings, relocation plans, buyouts, pressure, neglect, or some combination of these methods. Each creates opportunities for resistance. The neighbourhood zoning also reflects earlier organising victories. When luxury hotel proposals threatened the district in the early 1980s, activists helped secure community benefits, preserve housing, limit building heights, and restrict many commercial uses above the lower floors. Those measures reduced the ability of investors to replace residential buildings with large office or hotel projects. The physical form of the Tenderloin became a defence. Its older buildings remained relatively small compared with downtown towers. Many lots were controlled by different owners. Hotels contained numerous occupied rooms. Historic architecture added another layer of regulation. In 2009, the Uptown Tenderloin Historic District was listed in the National Register of Historic Places. The designation covered all or part of 33 blocks and recognised both architectural and social history across periods extending from the early 20th century through 1974. Historic recognition did not freeze the neighbourhood. Buildings could still be renovated, damaged, sold, or neglected. A national designation did not guarantee affordability. It did make the district's surviving hotels, apartment houses, theatres, and commercial structures harder to dismiss as worthless remnants awaiting replacement. The buildings told a story the city could no longer completely deny. They were not simply obsolete structures. They were evidence of the post-earthquake hotel district, the entertainment economy, immigrant settlement, queer history, labour, vice, reform, and low-income residential life. Preservation and affordability remained different goals, but in the Tenderloin they often supported one another. An old hotel preserved only for its exterior could become an expensive boutique property. An affordable hotel preserved without adequate maintenance could become unsafe. The strongest neighbourhood organisations tried to protect both the building and the people living inside it. TNDC began with one deteriorated SRO in 1981 and expanded through property acquisition, tenant organising, supportive housing, and neighbourhood advocacy. Its early purchases removed hundreds of units from the speculative market, while later work expanded into services, youth programs, food access, and resident leadership. Other organisations developed different roles. The Tenderloin Housing Clinic used legal action and tenant organising. Glide provided meals, recovery support, spiritual community, and political visibility. SRO collaboratives documented building conditions. Health clinics treated residents who lacked stable access to medical care. Immigrant organisations translated notices and helped families navigate schools, benefits, and housing systems. No single institution controlled the neighbourhood. Together, they made outside control more difficult. A landlord confronting one tenant possessed a major advantage. A landlord confronting residents, attorneys, inspectors, organisers, and a non-profit interested in purchasing the property faced a different situation. A city agency could ignore one complaint. It was harder to ignore a room filled with residents who had organised their testimony and brought reporters. This network did not eliminate abuse. Tenants were still displaced. Buildings still failed inspections. Fires still forced residents from their homes. Supportive housing programs still struggled with staffing, maintenance and funding. Non-profits could become distant from the people they served. The network changed the cost of removal. That cost helps explain why the Tenderloin remained a low-income neighbourhood, while many central urban districts across the United States were transformed more completely. Its reputation also protected it in an unexpected way. For decades, stories of danger discouraged some middle-class residents, investors and tourists. People who might pay high prices to live near downtown avoided the district because they feared its streets. That fear often exaggerated risk and reduced residents to stereotypes. It also limited market pressure. A building in another central neighbourhood could be emptied, renovated and marketed through the surrounding district's desirable image. A Tenderloin property carried an address that some affluent customers considered unacceptable. Developers tried to overcome this by changing names, emphasising proximity to Union Square, or describing buildings as part of a neighbouring district. Boundaries became marketing tools. A hotel could be presented as near the theatre district rather than inside the Tenderloin. An apartment building could be described as Lower Nob Hill. A business near Market Street might identify itself with Mid-Market or Civic Centre. The Tenderloin's name was useful when selling a story of urban excitement. It was less useful when selling expensive housing. Residents noticed attempts to erase the name because renaming often came before displacement. A place declared to be a new district could be separated from the people whose history made it recognisable. The Tenderloin's identity therefore became another form of resistance. Community leaders defended the name while challenging the stigma attached to it. They argued that the neighbourhood contained families, schools, art, immigrant businesses, historic buildings, senior residents, and organised tenants. Not only the behaviour visible in police reports. This defence did not require pretending that the streets were safe or that public suffering was misunderstood. It required insisting that suffering was not the only truth. A child walking to an after-school programme and a person selling drugs might appear on the same block. A tourist entering a theatre and tenant returning from dialysis might share the same sidewalk. A renovated restaurant could operate beside an SRO, where residents used a common bathroom. The Tenderloin refused simple description because contradictory lives remained close together. That closeness weakens every attempt to impose a single policy. Aggressive policing may reduce visible dealing, while frightening undocumented residents and people who have experienced police abuse. Closing a hotel for severe code violations may protect tenants from unsafe conditions while leaving them without replacement housing. Opening a service centre may provide necessary care while increasing foot traffic and conflict around nearby homes. Building market-rate housing may add residents and retail spending while raising land values and eviction pressure. Restricting development may preserve existing buildings while limiting opportunities to add better housing. There is no policy without consequences for someone already there. The neighbourhood is not ungovernable because residents are irrational. It is difficult to govern because every decision exposes competing needs that San Francisco has postponed elsewhere. Affordable housing must coexist with building safety. Public space must serve residents who want calm and people who have nowhere private to go. Addiction must be treated as a health issue while dangerous dealing remains a criminal business. Mental illness requires care, but severe behaviour can still threaten others. Sex workers need safety, rights, and alternatives, while residents may object to commercial activity outside their homes. Immigrant families need stability in a district containing adult entertainment and street disorder. Tourism supports employment while increasing pressure to convert residential space. The Tenderloin places all these conflicts within walking distance. Political leaders often enter office believing that better coordination will solve them. Coordination matters. Agencies do fail to communicate. Police, public health, housing, sanitation, transportation, and social services may pursue different goals on the same street. But coordination cannot create resources that do not exist. A police officer cannot place someone in a treatment bed if every bed is occupied. An outreach worker cannot offer permanent housing if none is available. A building inspector cannot order expensive repairs without risking the closure of a property whose tenants have no affordable alternative. A non-profit cannot purchase every threatened hotel. A school cannot remove the conditions children encounter after they leave its doors. Control fails because the available tools are smaller than the forces shaping the district. Those forces include regional housing shortages, national drug markets, income inequality, healthcare failures, criminal justice policy, immigration, tourism, and the extraordinary value of San Francisco land. The Tenderloin is local, its causes are not. The arrival of powerful synthetic opioids made this especially clear. A small quantity could produce many doses. The risk of fatal overdose increased. Drug markets became more visible and dangerous. People already living with trauma, illness, or unstable housing faced a substance capable of quickly creating dependency and death. City government responded with public health outreach, overdose reversal medication, treatment efforts, police operations, emergency declarations, and repeated promises to restore street order. Each response addressed part of the crisis. None could control the international supply of drugs, the national addiction treatment system, the regional housing market, or the personal histories that brought thousands of people into danger. The Tenderloin again became the stage on which a much larger American failure was performed. Television images and political speeches focused on several blocks. The supply chain extended across borders. The money moved through criminal networks far beyond San Francisco. The customers came from inside and outside the district. The shortage of treatment and housing existed across California. Yet the neighborhood carried the name of the crisis. This has happened repeatedly because concentrating a problem makes it seem controllable. Officials can draw a boundary around the Tenderloin. They cannot draw a boundary around addiction, poverty, or mental illness. The district's residents have learned to be suspicious whenever someone claims to have discovered a final answer. They have heard promises of moral reform, urban renewal, redevelopment, zero tolerance, revitalization, rescue, and transformation. Some programs improved lives. None ended the neighborhood's central contradiction. San Francisco wants the Tenderloin to provide inexpensive housing, social services, nightlife, cultural history, and space for people excluded elsewhere. At the same time, it wants the district to look as orderly and profitable as the neighborhoods that do not perform those functions. The two demands cannot be satisfied without major investment and a fairer distribution of responsibility. As long as other districts resist shelters, supportive housing, treatment programs, and low-income development, those needs will continue to concentrate near the places where such facilities already exist. As long as the region fails to build enough affordable housing, the Tenderloin's rooms will remain essential. As long as public systems discharge people without stable destinations, the streets will receive them. As long as visitors and wealthier residents consume nightlife, drugs, sex, and entertainment while distancing themselves from the people who provide them, the district will continue to carry the city's hypocrisy. No one has controlled the Tenderloin because too many people depend on it remaining what they claim to oppose. Developers depend on its central location. Tourism depends on nearby workers and inexpensive services. Hospitals and public agencies depend on residential hotels accepting people with nowhere else to live. Political leaders depend on the neighbourhood as a visible place where they can demonstrate action. News organisations depend on images that confirm a story of urban disorder. Service organisations depend on proximity to the people they assist. Residents depend on rooms, relationships, and institutions they cannot easily replace. Even the wider city depends on the Tenderloin absorbing discomfort that would otherwise be distributed across more powerful neighbourhoods. This dependence is rarely described as dependence. It is described as failure. The neighbourhood is said to have failed to improve, failed to become safe, failed to attract the right investment, or failed to respond to enforcement. That language places responsibility on the place, rather than on the systems using it. The Tenderloin has changed constantly. Its buildings replaced sand dunes and wooden houses. Its hotels replaced much of the pre-earthquake district. Its saloons became speakeasies. Its dance halls became jazz clubs, adult theatres, churches, markets, apartments, and service centres. Its population shifted through migration, war, redevelopment, ageing, immigration, and economic change. Its residents organised new forms of housing and political power. What stayed was not a fixed culture of disorder. What stayed was the neighbourhood's role as a refuge for activities and people San Francisco needed but did not fully accept. Control has always failed because that role cannot be eliminated through control. A raid cannot replace a room. A development plan cannot replace a community network. A police operation cannot replace psychiatric care. A sanitation order cannot replace a bathroom. A speech cannot replace treatment. A luxury building cannot replace hundreds of low-cost hotel rooms simply because it occupies the same land. The Tenderloin forces the city to face these differences. That is why its history feels unfinished. There is no moment when the district becomes entirely respectable, entirely lawless, entirely protected, or entirely abandoned. Each generation inherits the same streets and gives the conflict new names. The people in authority change, the promises change, the substances, businesses, and technologies change. The basic question remains: who is allowed to live in the centre of San Francisco when they cannot afford the life the city advertises? The Tenderloin has answered through survival. The answer can be seen in a hotel window where a tenant has kept the same curtains for years. It can be heard in several languages inside a corner market. It appears in a historic theatre entrance, a clinic waiting room, a church meal line, an apartment where children complete homework, and a lobby where residents gather to challenge another proposed change. None of these scenes is dramatic enough to dominate the neighbourhood's reputation. Together, they explain why it remains. The Tenderloin was never outside San Francisco. It was created by San Francisco's economy, protected by its corruption, rebuilt by its investment, crowded by its wars, burdened by its redevelopment, preserved by its housing struggles, and blamed for the consequences of its inequality. The city could never control the Tenderloin because the district has always contained the parts of the city that control prefers not to recognise. Every effort to erase those parts has sent more people into its rooms. Every effort to clean the streets without protecting the residents has produced resistance. Every effort to rebuild the neighbourhood for someone else has encountered people who were already home. Late at night, the streets still reveal the old structure. Hotel windows remain lit above businesses that have changed names many times. Workers finish shifts while other workers begin them. Residents return with grocery bags. Music leaves an open door. A police vehicle pauses at a corner. An outreach worker speaks quietly to someone on the sidewalk. A visitor walks quickly toward a theatre or hotel. Mourning will alter the crowd. It will not settle the argument. The Tenderloin continues because it is not one thing waiting to be corrected. It is housing, commerce, refuge, exploitation, memory, labour, danger, culture and resistance occupying the same blocks. No authority has ever separated those elements for long. No reformer has removed vice without leaving demand. No developer has added value without threatening someone's home. No police campaign has produced safety without raising questions about power. No service system has met every need. No resident coalition has won enough to stop organising. The neighbourhood remains beyond complete control, not because no one has tried hard enough, but because complete control would require deciding which of its people and purposes no longer belong. The residents who survived earlier versions of that decision know exactly what it means. They have seen buildings emptied in the name of improvement. They have watched communities disappear beneath construction. They have heard temporary measures become permanent losses. They have learned that the safest promise is not that someone powerful will save the Tenderloin. It is that the people living there will continue to defend their place within it. And so the neighbourhood remains in the centre of San Francisco, close enough to wealth for the contrast to be unavoidable, old enough to remember every attempted transformation, and crowded enough that no single story can contain it. The Tenderloin has never been fully controlled. It has been negotiated, exploited, protected, neglected, raided, rebuilt, organised, and misunderstood. Most of all, it has endured.